Honestly, I don't care whether you believe this or not. The whole situation sounds insane even to me. I don't blame anyone who says it's nonsense. Maybe I wouldn't believe it either. I'm not trying to make myself look better, but I'm also not going to reveal anything that could expose my identity. Part 1. My parents told my brother to take my house because I don't have a family. I'm in my early 30s, single, and childless. My brother is 29 and already has 4 kids. Their first child was born when he was 22, the second a year later, the third 2 years after that, and the fourth arrived just a couple of months ago. I've never gotten along with his wife. She constantly behaves arrogantly and tries to provoke me, and the moment I react even slightly, she immediately plays the victim. She can start crying on command and put on a whole performance to win sympathy. My parents and brother adore her, even though they know exactly what she's like. They simply don't care. I'll admit she's a beautiful woman, but her personality is so unbearable that I can never be attracted to her. She also refuses to work, despite having a college degree. My mother joyfully babysits the kids all day, so their entire household depends financially on my brother. They also can't afford to live anywhere except my parents' home, and that house already barely fits everyone. 4 kids and 4 adults living under one roof in a small 3-bedroom house built in the 1960s. Growing up, my younger brother was clearly the favorite. We're 3 years apart, but he quickly developed a superiority complex because I was always punished whenever I reacted to his behavior. It was obvious my parents cared more about him. He got everything he wanted, unless someone outside the family called my parents out on it, and that happened often enough that my parents eventually moved us 240 kilometers away from the rest of the family just to avoid criticism. We only saw relatives during holidays because the drive was 3 hours long. My brother used physical force against me several times. He constantly flirted with my first girlfriend until she broke up with me, and he mocked every mistake I ever made. My parents would just tell me to ignore it whenever I got upset. The only time they treated us equally was when they were trying to keep up appearances in front of other people during holidays. It was almost funny watching their faces when they had to pretend everything was fine. We had relatives who loved to gossip, so my parents threatened to take away my belongings if I ever told anyone what actually went on in our home. When I turned 18 and moved out, my parents practically celebrated because they no longer had to support me. I hadn't even finished school yet, but living on other people's couches was still better than living with them. I kept minimal contact afterward. They didn't even show up for my high school graduation. But honestly, I didn't care anymore. I only saw my parents and brother during holidays. Then the pandemic started in 2020, and things got rough. I lost my job and couldn't renew my lease. My roommate also lost his job, so we couldn't keep the apartment on unemployment benefits. I loved that place, but when the lease expired, he moved back to his relatives, and I had to sell almost all of my belongings because I was close to homelessness. I shouldn't have been paying for such an expensive apartment, but I like living comfortably. Until life taught me otherwise. I realized I should have lived somewhere cheaper and saved money for emergencies. But I had a plan. I owned a pickup truck and bought a camper for $1,000 in decent condition. I installed it on the truck so I could live in it temporarily. That temporary solution ended up lasting much longer than expected. I hoped to stay on my parents' property, where my brother and his family also lived. But when I asked my parents if I could park my camper there for a while, they said their house was already too crowded and they didn't want me there. We hadn't been close for 10 years anyway. They told me they'd agree only if I paid them the same amount as renting an apartment in their area. Way too much just to park a truck outside. I was unemployed and trying to save every dollar from unemployment benefits. For that price, I could have rented an actual apartment. My parents said the camper was an eyesore and told me to leave if I wouldn't pay. My sister-in-law thought it was hilarious that I had to live in a camper, and my brother joined her, pointing at me, calling me a homeless drifter. That first night, I parked in a store's parking lot. I was terrified someone might try to break in. I barely slept. I had nowhere to go. Relatives with property lived far away, friends were all in apartments, and I didn't want to leave the area. I also needed a stable place to receive mail. Finding consistent parking spots was hard. I searched months for a job similar to my previous one. Meanwhile, I dealt with all kinds of problems. Panhandlers, drug users, random people telling me to leave because my camper ruined their view, and even a man claiming to be from an HOA who demanded I leave despite not being anywhere near their neighborhood. He became aggressive, so I left to avoid trouble. I used extension cords to plug into random outdoor outlets whenever I could. Not the best thing to do, but I needed my fridge to work. I had a small solar panel for my phone, but no generator. Too loud and expensive. After months of this, I finally found a job. I had to move to a neighboring town and accept work that had nothing to do with retail. I'd sworn never to return to retail after college, and I was close to breaking that promise more than once. I still received unemployment benefits, but I had nowhere to live and nothing to do except read, watch DVDs, use my phone or laptop, and track which public restrooms I could use. When I finally got hired, I practically lived at the workplace. Behind the warehouse, there were old employee parking spots no one used because they were too far from the building. My manager, the owner of the company, didn't mind me staying there. He even liked the arrangement because I was available for any shift. He allowed me to remove the camper from the truck and keep it in one of the unused parking spots so I could drive the truck freely.
I'm still not sure if what I did back then was legal, but nobody questioned it, so I said nothing. I was practically on standby at all times. Whenever the workplace needed help, I showed up, and I worked almost every single day. My boss allowed me to connect my camper to the building's electricity and water. In exchange, I came in every Sunday and worked for free when the place was empty, except for the janitor and the security guard. I usually showered at a friend's apartment or at the local gym, since the camper didn't have one. I only had a portable chemical toilet, but I tried to avoid using it because cleaning it was awful. Whenever possible, I used public restrooms, and I also had a key to the warehouse, so I could use the bathroom there anytime. The night security guard eventually became one of my closest friends. Heating the camper in winter was easy with a small electric heater. Summer, however, was unbearable, so I bought a used portable AC unit just to survive the heat. I made a lot of money through overtime and learned a ton from my coworkers. By mid-year, I earned a promotion. I became a supervisor and finally started making real money. That's when I decided I wanted a house. The fear I felt when I couldn't afford rent made me realize I needed something stable, long-term. I found a single-story house with 3 bedrooms just 3 kilometers from work with a small yard. I even negotiated the price down by $10,000. I poured almost all of my savings into the down payment and got approved for a mortgage. Finally, I didn't have to live in a camper anymore. There was enough space in the backyard to park my pickup truck and remove the camper from it, so I set it aside in case I ever needed it again. Once I fully settled into the house, I made a stupid mistake. I posted about it on social media. My parents saw the post, and that's when everything started spiraling. A few weeks later, my parents, my brother, and his wife showed up at my doorstep unannounced, demanding a tour of the house. I hadn't even given them the address. To this day, I don't know how they found it. None of my friends admitted telling them. My best guess? They followed me from work. And honestly, that wouldn't surprise me. The moment I opened the door, they barged in like loud tourists. They walked around the house as if they owned the place. My sister-in-law kept giving me smug little looks, and only later I understood why. It irritated me more than I can describe. My parents kept repeating how much space I had and how unnecessary it was for a lonely man without a wife or kids. Sure, I'm single now, but that doesn't mean it will always be that way. My brother kept commenting that my house was bigger than our parents and much closer to his workplace. Eventually, he asked to talk privately. Everyone else conveniently stepped outside to the terrace. That's when I realized something was definitely going on. My brother, let's call him Dan, told me the house was too big for one person and I should let him and his family move in because his wife was pregnant with their 4th child and my home was closer to his job. He pointed out that I had a camper, so I could just live outside in the yard while they took the house. He never once mentioned paying rent. Let me make it clear. He has a good job. He simply believed he deserved my house more than I did. He even started listing the rules I would have to follow, like not entering the house without giving them notice and a curfew. If he weren't my brother, I would have thought he had lost his mind. But honestly, Dan stopped living in reality years ago because our parents spoiled him to the point of delusion. I tried to argue, but he constantly interrupted me, acting like I didn't have a right to speak. I had no intention of renting to him, or anyone like him. I've read stories like this online, but never imagined I'd be living one of them. Yet here I was, dealing with narcissistic lunatics straight out of those posts. I pulled out my phone and started recording. Dan didn't even notice. He just kept waving his hands around and explaining why he needed the house more than I did. Then he tried to shake my hand as if we had already reached an agreement. That's when I finally snapped. I said no, loud enough for him to flinch. I rarely raised my voice growing up because I got punished for it, but this was my home, not theirs. I stood up and told him the house wasn't for rent, and the fact that he thought he could move in just because our parents wanted it meant nothing to me. I bought this house myself, and it wasn't my fault he kept having more kids while still living with our parents. Dan stepped close, not touching me, but inches away, and told me I didn't deserve the house and his family needed it more. I laughed in his face. I earned this home through hard work. Of course I deserved it. He started shouting that I didn't have a wife or kids and didn't need all this space, so I should let him have it. I told him I wouldn't give him anything. And again, he never offered to pay rent. If I agreed, I'd still be paying the mortgage while having nowhere to live. Then came his final argument. He didn't have to pay because we were family, and our parents said I should give him the house. I yelled back that their word wasn't law and they had zero authority over my property. And right on cue, my parents and sister-in-law stormed back inside. They surrounded me and tried to pressure me into agreeing. They were shouting from all sides. The phrase, "Do this for Dan," was repeated dozens of times. I told them they had no right to interfere in my life and ordered them to leave before I called the police. My sister-in-law started yelling that she was pregnant and I couldn't treat her this way. I told her I never promised her anything, that she had no right to take anything from me, and that I wasn't responsible for her or her kids. I also told her she was an arrogant jerk who never respected me, and that I didn't care how many children she had, she wasn't living in my house. She got so furious, she attacked me. She punched me in the face once and tried to hit again, but Dan held her back while she screamed that she wanted to claw my eyes out. I raised my phone, still recording, and told them I'd call the police if they didn't leave immediately. Slowly, my parents told Dan they were leaving. As they walked out, my mother said, "I had 1 week to come to my senses." I told her I never would. Before leaving, I warned my sister-in-law that I had video of everything and would file a police report if she tried anything. She screamed, covered her face, and ran out crying. My mother was the last to leave, repeating again that I had to do this for Dan. I told her it would never happen. Part 2. How they tried to steal my house when I wasn't home. After throwing them out, I immediately posted the whole story online for my extended family to see. I knew my parents' next move would be trying to twist the story to make me look like the villain. I had about 1 hour to get ahead of them, and I had video evidence. My plan worked. A few relatives supported me instantly. My parents, Dan, and his wife must have been preparing their own version, but it was too late. The truth was already out. They had a few sympathizers, but most relatives already knew how entitled they were. One unknown relative even called me, screaming that I was a terrible brother and needed to give the house to a real family. I hung up and blocked the number. A week later, my parents and Dan returned just like they promised. They rang the doorbell nonstop and pounded on the door. When I cracked it open, they tried to force their way inside, but I had installed door chains. My mother, in her fake sweet tone, asked if I was ready to let Dan move in. I told them all to get lost and never come back. She burst into dramatic tears and asked why I couldn't do this for my loving brother. I laughed and told her I didn't love him because he treated me like garbage for years, and they had always encouraged it. They left except for my mother's loud crying and the angry stares from the others. If anyone think it was suspiciously easy to get rid of them, it wasn't. I just didn't realize they had another plan. Because that Friday, when I came home from work, Dan's moving truck and minivan were parked in my driveway. His entire family was unloading their belongings. When he saw me, he smiled and waved like an idiot. My sister-in-law proudly announced that whether I liked it or not, they were moving in, because Mommy said it's okay and I always have to listen to Mommy. I was boiling with rage when I heard those words, watching her smug expression. I locked myself in my truck and immediately called the police. Once they realized what I was doing, my sister-in-law started pounding on the window, yelling at me to stop and insisting I couldn't do this to her because she and Dan needed that house. She screamed, "Why can't you do this for Dan?" I snapped back, "To hell with him. This is my damn house, not his." Then she threatened to scratch my truck if I didn't hang up on the police. The dispatcher heard everything because my window was slightly open. I warned her that if she damaged my truck, I'd sue her. Thankfully, she was smart enough to back off. When the police arrived, Dan and his wife had locked themselves and their kids inside my home. I explained the situation and showed the officers my ID with the current address. When we reached the front door, I saw they had changed the locks. The old lock, with the core punched out, was lying on the porch, and right next to it, the drill they used with a full set of bits. They couldn't have made it more obvious. I pointed out the broken lock and the drill, then explained everything leading up to this moment. Dan must have called my parents after I got home because they showed up while I was talking to the police. Immediately, they started lying, claiming I had agreed to rent the house to Dan and his family. I said that was a complete lie, and I could prove it. That's when Dan and his wife finally came out holding some papers, looking ridiculously confident, like they had outsmarted me. They had actually drafted and printed a fake lease agreement with a forged signature. The signature didn't even look remotely like mine. I doubt either one of them had ever seen my real signature, so it was incredibly stupid. I told my parents and Dan that this was blatant fraud, and that if the police investigated, they'd figure it out in seconds. I also warned Dan that an arrest could cost him his job, leaving his family with no income. I added that I'd hire a lawyer and sue for damages if anything in my house was stolen or broken, and I'd call child services if necessary. Dan turned pale. My mother, however, stepped between us again, insisting that I should do this for Dan, and that I should move into my camper so he could finally have a real home. I yelled back that if she thought it was such a good idea, she could give Dan her house. I told the police I wanted everyone out immediately, or I'd press charges. Loudly, I listed every crime: breaking into my home, drilling out the lock, forging documents, faking my signature, and the video I had of my sister-in-law attacking me. I made it clear that these charges could destroy their lives if I decided to go through with them, and the only reason I hadn't yet was because of Dan's kids. That finally scared my parents. My mother gave up and whispered something to my sister-in-law, while my father pulled down aside. My sister-in-law suddenly broke into loud tears, ripping the fake lease into pieces like confetti. An officer told her to pick it all up, or he'd find her for littering. Dan told his kids to start carrying their things back to the truck. The kids cried, and the oldest boy sobbed because he wasn't going to get his own room after all. Dan and his wife tried one last time to guilt-trip me, gathering the kids around like some dramatic movie scene. All the kids looked at me with trembling lips. She kept rubbing her pregnant belly, trying to look pitiful, and Dan made the saddest face he could, saying, "Please don't do this. We need to live here." I didn't budge. I told them to keep packing. They cried louder. Dan yelled, accusing me of being selfish for refusing to help my family. I laughed and told him he didn't want to share, he wanted to take. And no amount of tears would change the fact that he was no longer my brother, just a selfish man who thought he could take whatever he wanted from me, just like when we were kids. The police warned Dan to calm down or they'd cuff him on the spot. I asked the officers to stay until everyone left,
and they said they weren't going anywhere until it was resolved. A few minutes later, 2 more officers arrived, which made my parents hurry even faster. I forced Dan to hand me the keys to the new lock he installed. He hurled them toward a storm drain instead of giving them to me. An officer ordered him to retrieve them, so he had to remove the grate and get filthy climbing down to reach the keys. He grumbled and then threw them in my hand. I told them all to leave and never come back. My mother said she would disown me, and I answered with exaggerated sarcasm, pretending to be devastated about not attending the family gatherings where I was always treated like garbage because Dan was their golden child. My parents looked stunned, and even the police seemed disgusted by them. My mother broke down crying and walked off. My father stared at me like he wanted to hit me, and Dan silently held his kids, accepting defeat. Meanwhile, my sister-in-law threw a tantrum on my lawn. They eventually formed a line and passed boxes out of my house. Nothing had been unpacked yet, so they were done quickly. The whole time, my mother kept repeating that it was too late and that I could still do this for Dan. Trying to bargain in increasingly desperate ways, she offered to have Dan pay me rent. When that failed, she suggested I move back in with them and let Dan rent my house so we wouldn't have to live together. I told her to shut up and keep loading the truck. I didn't want Dan in my house, didn't want his money, and definitely didn't want to live with my parents again after the way they treated me growing up. Any deal with them would be a deal with the devil. My sister-in-law threw another fit when she heard that, dropped a box, and sat in the yard sobbing because she didn't want to move back into my parents' home. Eventually, everything was loaded, and before they left, I finally told my parents exactly what their behavior had done to me growing up. With 4 officers watching, they couldn't interrupt or walk away. For the first time in my life, I said everything. How they let Dan and his wife mock me, call me a bum, how they refused to let me park my camper on their property when I was homeless and trying to get back on my feet. They wanted to throw me out of my own home so Dan could live there for free. Yet when I had nowhere to go, they wanted to charge me money just to park on their driveway, even though they knew I'd lost my job. The officers looked at them with open disgust. I asked them what I ever did besides being born to deserve such treatment. When I finally achieved something in life, they tried to take it away for their favorite child. I told them I owed them nothing and would never ask for anything again. They had no answers. They just stood there like stunned fish. My father turned red from embarrassment, and my mother cried, saying she was a terrible person. I told her she was right. They were all the same, and I'm certain they'll eventually answer for it. They were awful people, and deep down, they knew it. But if I had confronted them without witnesses, they would have simply gotten angry and doubled down on blaming me. They'd been in denial for so long that it practically became part of who they were. My mother hid her face against my father's shoulder and cried, while my father looked defeated. Dan and his family avoided me while they finished loading their things into the truck. I made sure none of my belongings were missing, not that I had much furniture at the time. I was lucky to even have a couch. They eventually returned to their vehicles. My sister-in-law kept staring at me with pure hatred until Dan finally forced her into the minivan and drove away. Once they were gone, I went online and wrote about everything that had happened. My parents were too embarrassed to defend themselves this time. Our family had already been somewhat divided before, but now the balance shifted completely in my favor. Nearly all of my relatives supported me, and the few who didn't simply stayed neutral. No matter how many times my parents repeated, "We did it for Dan," no one cared anymore. Even relatives whom I never expected to stand with me took my side, including people who used to defend my parents. I even invited about half of the family to spend Christmas Eve at my new home. I didn't invite my parents. Surprisingly, Dan and his wife didn't block me on social media. Because of that, I learned that in early November, my sister-in-law gave birth to their 4th child. They were still living with my parents. I'm almost sure they knew I was checking their pages, because every couple of weeks my sister-in-law posted passive-aggressive complaints about how cramped my parents' house was, clearly trying to guilt-trip me. I'm sure it was driving my parents insane. They couldn't get any peace with 3 loud kids, an unstable daughter-in-law, and a newborn all under the same roof. Honestly, maybe they should have moved into a camper in their backyard and handed the entire house to Dan. They were always willing to sacrifice anything for him. Part 3. My parents, brother, and sister-in-law showed up at my home on Christmas Eve, even though they weren't invited. For everyone who said I needed cameras, I plan to install them once I can afford it. I'm still recovering financially after buying the house last year, and my old 3-year-old laptop can't handle a full security setup. A video doorbell will probably be the first thing I buy. As for those who insisted I should have had Dan and his wife arrested, the only reason I didn't was because they're parents. Their kids need them. If Dan had been arrested, he likely would have lost his job, and they would have had no income. And with a newborn, jail wasn't something I wanted for them. You don't need prison to get justice. The police helped enough without me filing charges. Would I show that level of mercy again? Probably not. And they know it. My sister-in-law kept posting her passive-aggressive online comments about me, especially after the baby was born. She said the same thing again and again in different words. She was tired of living with my parents, there wasn't enough space, she needed her own home, etc. As I mentioned, for Christmas Eve, I invited half the relatives. Everyone I invited came, even though some had to drive 3 or 4 hours. They told me they wanted to support me. Many praised me for the hard work it took to buy a house without anyone's help, and they were sorry for everything I'd been through. They asked why I hadn't just stayed with them instead of being practically homeless for so long. I admitted, a little embarrassed, that I was stubborn, attached to the area, and felt I had better job opportunities here. I also wanted to climb out of the mess on my own. They accepted that explanation. The party turned out to be the best we'd had in years. We listened to Christmas music, talked, laughed. For the first time in a long time, I felt genuinely happy. But I wouldn't be telling this story if it stayed that way. About 2 hours into the party, uninvited guests arrived. My parents, Dan, and my sister-in-law. They walked in with bright smiles, not even bothering to knock, as if my home still belonged to them. I turned off the music and told them to leave immediately. They begged to stay, claiming they brought gifts. Before I could answer, my uncle, my mother's brother, stood up and yelled at them. He told them they had no right to be in my home or my life after what they tried to do. Several relatives backed him up. This man used to adore my mother, but after learning the truth about how I'd been treated, his opinion changed completely. Then my grandparents, my mother's parents, stepped forward. Despite their age, they stood between us and told my parents that if they wanted to mend things with me, now was not the time. They said they had never been more disappointed in them. They told my parents that if they ever wanted to be part of my life again, they needed to start treating me like a son. Then they turned to Dan and his sister-in-law and said they were sick of seeing the constant complaints she posted online. They told her to drop it. My house was not going to become theirs. My sister-in-law burst into tears. She threw herself onto a chair, crying that it wasn't fair that I had a home while she had 4 kids and nowhere to go. She claimed she deserved this house more than I did and that her children needed more space. It was petty, but I told her loudly that she was a terrible mother. My mom was the one raising her children while she spent her days drinking, scrolling through her phone, and burning through Dan's paycheck. And on top of all that, she still dared to complain. I even joked that it was a miracle her newborn didn't get drunk from breast milk because of how much she drank. The room went silent. Everyone stared at me, and my sister-in-law demanded to know if I truly thought she was a bad mother. I said the facts spoke for themselves. If she wanted any chance of moving out someday, she needed to use her college degree, get a job, and learn how to manage money. My mother was already doing most of the child care. She'd have plenty of free time once the baby grew a bit older. Her oldest child, a 7-year-old, ran at me and started ticking me, yelling that I was a bad person because I didn't let them live in my house. Dan dragged him away, but the rest of the relatives immediately took my side again. They turned on my sister-in-law and Dan, criticizing them openly. Everyone was yelling, the baby was crying, all the kids were crying. Even Dan looked close to crying from the humiliation. He eventually sat down on the little bench near the entrance where I keep my shoes. He looked completely defeated, staring at the floor, unable to speak. If we'd been alone, I'm sure he'd tried again to demand my house like he did months ago. But not this time. Not with a room full of angry relatives watching him. His reputation was destroyed. Soon after that, my parents, Dan, and my sister-in-law left in total humiliation. The party continued. We avoided mentioning what had happened for the rest of the night. Everyone stayed over. I even let some relatives sleep in the camper so there'd be enough room. It actually made a surprisingly nice guest house, and they couldn't believe I had lived in it for nearly 2 years. I woke up early on Christmas morning, made coffee, and set out ibuprofen for anyone dealing with a hangover. People told me I was much better host than my parents had ever been. We all agreed to get together again next Christmas. After the holidays, my sister-in-law finally stopped posting passive-aggressive comments and even deleted the old ones. But right after New Year's, she posted again. She said she'd tried convincing my parents to buy a camper like mine, so they could put it in the backyard for themselves and Dan's family could take over the entire house. My parents shut that idea down immediately, angrily, from what I heard. She deleted that post after a couple of days, and since then she's barely posted anything. I think she finally realized complaining wouldn't get her anywhere, and Dan can't afford to move out on his salary anytime soon. Honestly, I won't be surprised if they have another child in the next few years. Since that Christmas, everything has been quiet. My parents, Dan, and their wife are keeping their distance, acting as though I don't exist, just like they did before I bought the house. And honestly, I prefer it that way. But they'll eventually come back into my life somehow. I'm sure of it. And I can only imagine what stupid thing they'll try next.
Part 4. My parents and Dan came back into my life earlier than I expected, and this time they wanted money. I doubt this will surprise anyone who commented on my previous posts. My parents did exactly what people predicted. They wanted either my money or my signature. I expected the classic narcissistic lines about how I owed them something, or maybe some moral speeches about sharing wealth, but those were just fears in my imagination. Reality turned out a bit different. It all started when my parents recently contacted me through social media and asked to meet in a public place of my choosing. I immediately suspected something shady, but I wasn't scared. Honestly, I was amused. They knew better than to try manipulating me anymore, so I was curious what they wanted this time. I chose a local restaurant. Dan came with them, but barely spoke. After awkward greetings and ordering drinks, they got to the point. My parents begged me to help Dan rent an apartment so he could finally move out of their house. Apparently, Dan's credit history wasn't great. Shocking, I know. Maybe because his wife constantly burned through his money. Dan asked me either to give them financial help or to co-sign the lease and possibly help pay the rent. I refused both. That's when Dan snapped. He yelled that he needed my help and that I should sacrifice money for his family since I didn't have my own. I just laughed and asked where he and my parents were when I needed help. Right, they were laughing at me when I was living out of a camper. Or should I bring up our childhood? I was more than ready to go into detail in front of an entire restaurant. My mother grabbed my arm, begging me not to talk about that. My father and Dan simply looked away. I asked them if they seriously thought I was some kind of wealthy man. Their faces gave me the answer. When I told them I didn't have that kind of money, they were shocked. I explained how I saved up for the down payment on my house and how I practically lived at work just to scrape together enough. I'm still recovering financially. Yes, I have a little flexibility every month, but most of it goes into savings. I asked Dan what his annual income was. When he answered, I pointed out that it was actually a bit higher than mine. Then I explained how around 70% of my income goes toward the mortgage, insurance, gas, internet, phone,
food and other bills, leaving me with maybe 30% to save. I need emergency savings. My pickup truck is from the last decade. If it breaks down, I'll need money for repairs or a new vehicle. I need a fund for house repairs, doctors, taxes, lawyers, or any unexpected expense. So no, I can't give money to Dan. And I refuse to co-sign anything because I'd be responsible if he failed to pay, which is probably the same reason my parents refused to co-sign for him themselves. My mother burst into tears again, but I stayed ahead of their manipulation. I told them directly, I am not a bank. I am not an idiot. They needed to hear it. I expected my father to explode, like he always did whenever I disagreed with Dan, but he didn't. His face showed no anger, only regret and defeat. Maybe he regretted being a terrible parent. Maybe he regretted that he could no longer intimidate me. Who knows? Either way, they had no arguments left, and I wasn't giving them money. Dan stood up, said this was a waste of time, and started to leave. My mother apologized for him, but he walked out anyway. To kill them with kindness, I offered to pay for everyone's meal since we were already there. They couldn't refuse a free lunch, so they stayed. I avoided talking about money. Dan either ate silently, stared at his phone, or said nothing. My parents made small talk. They mentioned they had joined a local Christian church and had been attending for 2 weeks. I told them, good for you. Of course, they invited me to go as well. I simply said no thanks, and to their credit, they didn't push. When the meal was over, Dan left a $10 tip and walked out without saying a word. My mom apologized again, and then we all went our separate ways. That was it. Far less dramatic than expected. As for my former sister-in-law, she still complains about my parents online. She hates that she's not the queen of their house. Apparently, her toxicity is finally getting to my parents. She even wants my parents to move into a camper, like I had to, so her family could take over the whole house. They refuse every time. She seems to have a little fan base because occasionally some stranger messages me, angrily telling me I should have given my house to her. I don't argue anymore. I just block them. Although one persistent troll somehow got my phone number and used to call me from random numbers to say I should step aside for a real family man like Dan. I ignore them too. Lately the calls have been fading. Maybe they gave up. Part 5. My parents and my brother aren't doing well lately, though I'm fine. Ever since last Christmas, aside from the money request and one recent confrontation with my former sister-in-law, things have been quiet. I installed several cameras around my home, including a video doorbell. I didn't tell my family, just in case. So far, no one has tried to break in. I also rented out 2 rooms in my house, one to a close friend and the other to his buddy. They turned out to be great guys and great roommates, quiet, respectful, and they even set up small fridges in their rooms so they wouldn't clutter the main one. I offered rent so affordable they couldn't refuse. This significantly increased my monthly income. Even after taxes, I'm able to save much more because the rent covers a big chunk of my mortgage. How did my parents, Dan, and my former sister-in-law react to me renting rooms to friends? Badly. My father and Dan said nothing, but my former sister-in-law had a full meltdown. She exploded so aggressively that my mother came to me crying, saying I could have rented the rooms to Dan and his family. We argued. I pointed out that these were the same people who changed the locks on my house so they could move in without permission. You wouldn't want people like that living with you, so why would I? And my house wouldn't fit them anyway. It's a 3-bedroom home. I live in the master bedroom. That leaves 2 small rooms for Dan, his wife, and 4 kids. Even if I agreed to live with them, which I never would, there simply isn't enough space. And my mother knows I can't tolerate my former sister-in-law because she provokes me on purpose. They all mocked me when I was homeless, so why would I reward them with discounted rent? My current tenants are 2 single men in their 30s whom I get along with really well. My mother cried for a while, but eventually admitted she was just desperate. How did my parents find out I was renting the rooms? My former sister-in-law was stalking me online, saw something, told my parents, and then my mother came to me in tears. After that, they stopped bothering me about the house. Meanwhile, things got much worse in their household. My former sister-in-law turned out to be even worse than I imagined. I already knew she was manipulative and dramatic, but she fell even lower in my eyes when we learned that Dan's youngest child wasn't actually his. Yes, she cheated on him. Not exactly surprising in hindsight. Dan's parents kicked her out, Dan filed for divorce, and because our state still allows fault-based divorce, he won the case. He also successfully petitioned to have his name removed from the youngest child's birth certificate. After everything that happened, including the time they tried forcing me to hand over my house, their home life completely collapsed. And somehow, my former sister-in-law blamed me. She convinced herself that I was secretly rich, like I'd won the lottery or inherited money, and that I should have shared my wealth. According to her, she talked my parents and Dan into showing up at my Christmas party because she hoped they could get back on my good side. She also admitted it was her idea to ask me for money for an apartment. Her fantasies crashed when Dan and my parents told her the truth about my financial situation. And when my relatives confronted them at my Christmas party, it ruined my parents' reputation even more and finally made them stop listening to her. And, as I mentioned in the last post, my parents started going to church again. Maybe because last year I told them they were probably going to hell for the things they'd done. I'm not saying that's the real reason, but it was satisfying.
If only things were that simple. Even though my parents hadn't gone to church in over 20 years, they still came to my house, without my brother, to apologize in person after they read the first 3 parts of my story. Yes, they found them. They also know everything I've written here, and they're extremely upset about it. But reading a story about themselves turned out to be the only way for them to understand what kind of people they had actually been. I had never seen my father apologize to anyone like that. He's a terrible actor, so it felt genuine. My parents fully admitted everything they did to me and acknowledged that there was no excuse for it. They even called themselves narcissists and openly admitted that they hurt me deeply. Then they shifted the blame onto my sister-in-law. And while she definitely wasn't innocent, she wasn't the only one at fault. My parents had already been attending therapy for a while and suggested family counseling for all of us. I declined. I'm not ready for that emotionally. Dan never apologized to me, but whenever the past came up, he looked genuinely remorseful. Meanwhile, his marriage completely collapsed. His wife finally revealed her true nature to him and to my parents, and they realized she wasn't the person she pretended to be. But things only got worse. She kept trying new ways to get what she wanted. She constantly showed my parents listings of used RVs, trying to pressure them into buying one so they could move into it. That way, Dan and she could have the main house. She did this no matter how many times they asked her to stop. She even said my parents should just travel the country like normal retirees. Even for her, that was ridiculous. My parents suggested the opposite. She and Dan could buy an RV and live in it. She insisted that was impossible because she was a mother. When that didn't work, she actually took the baby and disappeared for several days. They knew she was fine because her phone stayed on, and she responded with short, passive-aggressive messages. When she returned, she was even angrier that no one gave in while she was gone. She refused to go to church, but Dan started going with my parents and brought his older kids with him, except for the baby, because she forbade him to take the infant anywhere. I personally don't go to church. I believe in God, but religion never helped me as a kid. Part 6. How Dan found out the truth about his wife. Most of this information came from Dan and my parents. I'm just retelling it. Back in March, Dan suddenly accused his wife of cheating. It shocked all of us because we thought he was completely under her control. Turns out, he wasn't. You all remember how he treated me whenever I stood up to him. Well, his wife didn't get off easy either. He finally pulled his head out of the sand and started connecting the dots.
He secretly ordered DNA tests for all his kids. 3 of them were his. The youngest wasn't. For reference, Dan and I have nearly identical straight, almost black hair, same as our parents. His wife's hair is also dark and straight, but the baby's hair was light and curly. Dan thought it would darken with age, but it never did. That was his biggest red flag. He confronted her with the DNA results in front of our parents. She burst into tears and insisted it was a lab mistake. She used every cliché: denial, half-confessions, manipulation. But Dan didn't buy it. He dug far deeper than I ever expected. He had phone call logs, text messages, bank statements, the DNA test, everything. He even identified the man she had been cheating with, who likely fathered the baby because he had the same light curly hair. The evidence was bulletproof. Dan admitted she hid the affair so badly that uncovering it was easy. My parents demanded she leave their house immediately. She completely lost control, screaming, then becoming violent. My mom had to call the police. Yes, she was arrested. She scratched Dan and my father with her long fake nails, and even her older son got hit when he stepped in. Dan recorded everything on his phone, so the police had plenty of proof. Her parents had to bail her out. Then they returned for the baby, her things, and her car. A few days later, she showed up at my house. Apparently, she was next on her list. As soon as I opened the door, she started rambling, accusing me of writing everything online and calling me her enemy. I'm not sure, but she seemed high. Her eyes looked strange, and she behaved even more erratically than usual. She ranted about how mothers with young children are sacred, and how giving me my house would have kept her family together. When I tried to speak, she shoved me and tried to cover my mouth. She even raised her hand like she was about to scratch me. Obviously, that didn't go her way. I told her I'd call the police if she didn't get her hands off of me immediately. I also told her everything was recorded on my doorbell camera. She panicked instantly. Then I verbally tore her to pieces. I told her she had the nerve to call me selfish when she was the one cheating, refusing to work, draining Dan's money, expecting my mother to raise her children, and acting like my house belonged to her. I called her a top-tier narcissist and told her to stop blaming others for her own choices. That was enough. She ran back to her car, sped off, and disappeared. That was my breaking point. Now that she and Dan had separated, I went to the police and filed charges for the stalking and assault she committed last year. Her recent behavior at my doorstep was added to the case. I also gave the video to Dan for his divorce lawyer. Yes, I filed for a restraining order, and it was granted easily. She hasn't bothered me since. She stayed with her lover throughout the divorce. I didn't know what kind of person he was, but anyone who gets a married woman pregnant isn't someone with strong morals. During the divorce, she admitted Dan was not a real man anymore because he couldn't provide the lifestyle she wanted. She genuinely believed she was a trophy wife who deserved someone wealthy. Dan said he burst out laughing in her face. He told her she wasn't even close to attractive enough to be a trophy wife and pointed out all her faults. She was humiliated again, and now she had to move back in with her parents. They made her work in their family business because Dan cut off her access to his accounts. She had maxed out every credit card he gave her. She complained about having to work, but honestly, her parents were probably the only ones willing to hire her with her criminal record and 10-year-long employment gap. The divorce was messy, and she ended up with almost nothing since she cheated, physically attacked Dan and our father, and hurt her own child. The divorce was legally considered her fault, so she lost any chance of getting what she wanted. More details will come in the next part.
Part 7. What I know about my brother Dan's divorce. Dan's attorney did everything he could to speed up the divorce, but it cost my brother a lot.
I don't know the exact amount, only that it wasn't cheap. My former sister-in-law, on the other hand, ended up in a severe financial crisis, and as you know, a cornered animal always fights back. She tried, but the law was not on her side, just like her money, which was disappearing fast. Her parents had to pay for her lawyer, but he wasn't very good. To make things worse, she brought her lover to the divorce hearing so he could testify on her behalf. He was charismatic, smooth-talking, and tried to use that to his advantage. He claimed she had suffered because of an inadequate husband, which forced her to look for comfort in another man's arms. He even said he was willing to take responsibility for the baby, the same baby he fathered. He also argued that she needed alimony to support herself and the child, pointing out that Dan's name was still on the birth certificate, so financially it should be Dan's responsibility. According to Dan, the guy spoke well, but was an idiot. The judge wasn't impressed either. He called the lover a hypocrite for claiming he wanted to take responsibility for his child while simultaneously demanding money from the man whose marriage he ruined. Dan considered filing a lawsuit against the guy for intentional infliction of marital breakdown, something that's still legal in a few U.S. states. But he couldn't prove she ever truly loved him before the affair. And after everything we had seen, none of us were convinced she loved him at all. She used him as a source of income, nothing more. Many people guessed she probably kept having babies to avoid working, and honestly, they were probably right. She tried to stall the divorce, but neither the judge nor Dan's lawyer let her. All the evidence stacked against her made her attempts to play the victim completely useless. Eventually, she just dropped the act because there was nothing left to hide. The court had everything: recordings from Dan and me, police reports, photos, videos, all proving she was abusive, manipulative, and narcissistic. When the divorce was finalized, she agreed to a deal. Dan took responsibility for part of the credit card debt, and his name was removed from the baby's birth certificate. She was granted partial custody of the older kids, but no alimony and none of the massive debt she had racked up. Her new job at her parents' business meant she finally had an income so she could begin paying off her own mess. She was allowed to see the kids almost any time, and even take them on weekends, but she barely tried. She took them out for cheap fast food a couple of times, but never kept them overnight. You'd think her parents would want to see their grandkids, but they never asked. They barely visited them even before the divorce. Now, they probably won't see them at all. As for Dan, he really did love his wife, and her betrayal destroyed him. The night he confronted her about the affair, he came to my place drunk with a bottle of whiskey in his hand and scratches on his face. I was terrified he had driven like that. But none of that mattered to him compared to being betrayed by the woman he married. He sat in my camper for hours so we wouldn't disturb my tenants. He drank straight from the bottle, crying that he was an idiot for marrying her. Nowadays, he only refers to her using one insulting nickname, and honestly, she earned it. Ironically, those few hours were the closest we had been in over 15 years. He didn't apologize directly, but he called himself a horrible person with terrible taste in women. Then he said, at least I didn't make his mistakes. Despite everything he put me through in the past, he's still my younger brother. I couldn't let him drive, so I took his keys and told him to stay the night. I set up a place for him to sleep in my camper since my rooms were rented out. He was in no condition to go home, and a taxi would have cost too much, plus he'd have to come back for his car. And honestly, I was scared he'd do something stupid if I let him leave. About a month after separating from his wife, Dan came back to ask if he could borrow my camper permanently. He said that after she moved out, he gave his bedroom to his oldest child, an 8-year-old boy, who previously had to share a room with his younger sisters. They had only hung curtains to divide the space, and the poor kid often slept on the couch just to avoid the chaos. He wanted to give him his own room. If he could have afforded his own camper, he would have bought one. So I gave in and let him have mine for the sake of the kids. No, I didn't charge him rent. He was already drowning financially because of the divorce. I brought the camper to my parents' backyard, and my dad installed a 30-amp breaker so the AC and heat would run properly. I do miss that camper. After living in it so many years, it feels like a part of me. But the only reason I loaned it out was the children. They are the only reason I still do anything for my parents or for Dan. I know I probably won't get the camper back anytime soon, and likely not in the same condition, but I made it clear that Dan and our parents are financially responsible for any damage. I also took tons of photos and videos before giving it to him. Dan even recorded a video agreeing to all the terms. It's basically a contract. Realistically, Dan won't be able to buy his own home for years. The divorce destroyed him financially. I don't know if he really likes living this new lifestyle or if he just pretends, but everyone in the family praised me for letting him use the camper. Some even said I'm the good brother he doesn't deserve. In any case, getting rid of my former sister-in-law was the first real step towards fixing our family. I still don't care much about my parents or Dan after they mistreated me my whole life, but I won't let his kids suffer for it. They've grown incredibly close to me. They're genuinely happy when they see me. I've even babysat them a few times. Without their mother around, they've become kinder, especially toward me. I'm finally starting to enjoy being an uncle. My dad often looks uncomfortable around me, but otherwise he behaves normally. Our relationship has improved, but I'm not letting my guard down. My parents are relieved she's out of their house. They even say they don't understand what they ever saw in her, especially my mother, who constantly fought with her about who ran the household. During the divorce, Dan also filed to have his name removed from the baby's birth certificate. My former sister-in-law didn't want that because it meant she'd lose any chance of getting money from him. But the court ordered a paternity test for the lover. I would have laughed for days if it turned out he wasn't the father either, but he was. Her lawyer realized she had no way to fight this. She couldn't afford a legal battle. She agreed to amend the birth certificate so the biological father, the man who got her pregnant, would take financial responsibility. Later, the guy contacted Dan through his attorney to say he broke up with her and wouldn't bother Dan again. I checked his social media when Dan sent me the profile. He was complaining nonstop about having to pay for a child he never planned to have, and whining that he was too young for that kind of responsibility. According to Dan's lawyer, the guy is a little over 40, though he looks younger. And that's where things end, hopefully. She's out of our lives. My parents and brother are trying, for once, to be better people. I'm surprisingly happy to finally enjoy being an uncle. And my home, thankfully, is still mine.
Part 8. My ex-sister-in-law saw my posts online. She was furious because there was nothing she could do about them. Thanks to the restraining order, she couldn't contact me directly. She probably couldn't afford a lawyer either, since the divorce had hit her finances hard. She complained to Dan, demanding he tell me to remove my posts. Dan read them too, but he had no problem with them. He said they served as a reminder of the scumbag he used to be. Besides, I was still helping him, despite everything he had done to me. My parents have also been trying to treat Dan and me more equally when I'm around. My father is still quiet in my presence. Someone joked that he just doesn't know how to communicate with me anymore, after all those years of pitting me against Dan. My mother has developed a habit of apologizing for even small things around me. She told Dan that both she and my father were often criticized by relatives and their psychologist, and now she feels the need to apologize for everything. The ex-sister-in-law found out that Dan borrowed my camper so his son could have his old bedroom. As a typical abuser, she mocked him, claiming he now lived like a homeless person. Dan took it calmly.
He knew that's exactly how she would react. For him, she was practically dead to him, and her insults didn't register. He explained that living in the old camper was a choice to prioritize his children so his son could have his own room, something the ex-sister-in-law never did. She used her children and pregnancies to avoid work and emotionally manipulate everyone. Early in the divorce, Dan realized she had no intention of changing. Dan told me that his ex-wife threw a huge fit over my recent posts, but no one contacted me on her behalf to try to remove them. She'll just have to live with the shame. Lately, she's been trying to behave better toward Dan, likely because living with her parents isn't fun. Dan tolerates her when she visits because she's the mother of his children, nothing more. He said he can never see her the same way again, and the mere thought of her disgusts him. Reconciliation? Practically impossible. Part 9. My pickup truck got egged on Halloween. This happened late at night or early morning on November 1st. I suspect it was my ex-sister-in-law. The person caught on my cameras wore multiple layers of thick clothing, big glasses covering the eyes, and a scarf over the lower face. I couldn't even tell if it was a man or a woman. They came on foot, so there was no car to track. They were roughly the same height as my ex-sister-in-law, but that alone wasn't enough to prove anything. If it was her, she must have known about my cameras, which is why she covered herself so thoroughly. A small act of egged revenge might have been the smartest thing she did in years, and a way to put her education to use. It happened around 3 a.m. I was sound asleep and didn't hear anything. The person threw about a dozen eggs at my pickup. They didn't try to do real damage and disappeared quickly after the last egg. I didn't notice anything until I left for work in the morning. During lunch, I drove the truck to a local car wash. Most of the eggs washed off. Eggs can damage paint, but my 1990s pickup wasn't in pristine condition anyway. I took photos and filed a police report, attaching the video as evidence, but so far nothing has come of it. No real damage was done, aside from my irritation and the $15 I spent at the car wash. If it was my ex-sister-in-law, she was clever enough to throw eggs instead of scratching the paint or slashing tires. I don't expect much from the police, who probably dismissed it as some kid's prank. I at least filed a report in case something happens again. I waited a bit before writing this post to see if anything else would occur. Nothing did. I'd appreciate any advice on what to do if something like this happens again.
Hi everyone. I turned 18 just a few days ago, and for my birthday, my dad surprised me with something incredible. My very first international trip to India, just the two of us. This trip was supposed to be something really special for so many reasons. My mom passed away when I was only 6. To cope with the loss, my dad and I used to watch Indian movies together all the time. They were colorful, uplifting, and helped brighten even the darkest days. That's how I fell in love with Indian culture. My mom loved those films too. She even had a collection of traditional Indian outfits, even though she never actually got to visit India herself. Before she died, she and my dad promised we'd go there as a family one day. Sadly, she passed away from a sudden brain aneurysm in her sleep before we could make that dream come true. She was only 32. After her death, it was just me and Dad. Watching movies together became our little ritual to keep her memory alive and stay close. Over the years, it made our bond stronger than ever. I know Mom would be proud of us today. That's why India has always held such a deep emotional meaning for both of us. It's not just a trip, it's a promise finally coming true. When Dad revealed at my birthday party that he'd booked the trip, I was ecstatic. I couldn't stop smiling. But not everyone was happy for me. My stepmom, Susan, and her daughter, Nadia, 17, looked like someone had slapped them. And sure enough, after the guests left, I overheard them arguing with my dad. From what I caught, Susan thought he should have postponed the trip so we could all go as a family. Honestly, I was relieved that it would just be the two of us. I don't get along with Susan or Nadia at all, and past family vacations with them were a nightmare. I couldn't imagine them ruining this one too, especially since it meant so much to me emotionally. Luckily, they had their own reasons not to join anyway. Nadia had her final exams and upcoming graduation, and Susan was tied up with an important project at work. Still, I can't help but feel Dad timed things perfectly so it could be just us, even if he'll never admit it. Susan and Nadia came into my life about 5 years ago. At first, everything seemed fine. They acted friendly enough while Dad was just dating Susan. But once he married her 2 years ago, things shifted. Their attitude toward me became cold and strange for no reason I could figure out. I hadn't done anything differently, yet suddenly I was treated like an outsider in my own home. And now, well, let's just say their jealousy hit a whole new level. Things were already bad with my stepmom and stepsister, but what they did before my trip crossed every line. I was never close with Susan or Nadia, but at least in the beginning our relationship was civil and polite. That all changed after Dad married Susan. Suddenly, she started treating me like dirt, and Nadia copied every move her mother made. They'd talk down to me, make nasty little remarks, and act cruel, but only when Dad wasn't around. The moment he walked into the room, they'd flip the switch and turn into sweet, smiling angels. It was so fake it made my skin crawl. Eventually, I needed to tell Dad what was going on. We sat down for a family talk, and at first, Susan and Nadia denied everything. Luckily, I had recorded one of our earlier conversations where they were openly horrible to me. With evidence on the table, they couldn't lie anymore. So instead of denying, they switched to emotional manipulation. They both burst into tears and told Dad they only acted that way because they felt like I hadn't accepted them as family, which was total nonsense. I did see them as family. It was them who treated me like garbage. Yet somehow they expected me to keep being nice to them while they showed me zero respect. Dad was confused and torn. Susan was the first woman he'd really cared for since Mom, and I knew he didn't want to lose that relationship so easily. He asked all of us to try harder to get along. For his sake, I agreed to keep things civil. After that, their behavior shifted again. Instead of being nice in front of Dad and cruel behind his back, they just chose to completely ignore me whenever he wasn't around. It was like I didn't exist. Honestly, I preferred it that way. At least they weren't actively tormenting me. For Dad's sake, we kept up the performance of being one happy family, and that carried on for about a year. Fast forward to just a few days ago. The morning after my birthday, Dad and I had breakfast together, and I pulled him aside. I asked him straight out if Susan and Nadia were upset about not joining us on the India trip. He admitted they were, but also reminded me how much this trip meant to us, especially with it falling so close to Mom's death anniversary. He wanted this to be our special time together, just father and daughter. He promised he'd smooth things over with them later. That was fine by me. Honestly, vacations with Susan and Nadia were torture. Dad and I are explorers. We love walking around, sightseeing, soaking up every bit of culture. They, on the other hand, prefer to sit in the hotel and complain if we're even a little late for dinner. To me, that's not a vacation. That's being trapped. India was supposed to be different. India was supposed to be ours. I didn't think there was anything wrong with that, especially since Susan and Nadia had taken their own little trips together in the past. The only real difference was that ours was longer and farther away, 10 days overseas instead of just a weekend somewhere nearby. But still, it felt completely fair. Dad told me not to stress, to focus on packing and getting ready. He promised he'd deal with Susan and Nadia after we got back. So I did exactly that. For the past 2 days, I was walking on air, too excited to care about their drama. Yesterday, I finished packing everything, double-checked my documents, and tucked my passport into my bag so it would be ready. Our flight was scheduled for today. But now, I don't even know if we're going anymore, because Susan and Nadia crossed a line so insane I still can't believe it. They burned my passport. Yes, burned it. Not lost, not misplaced, they literally destroyed it. I found out just a few hours ago. It was around 6 p.m. yesterday when I was organizing paperwork and noticed it was missing from my bag. By 2 a.m., the truth came out. They had actually set it on fire.
They burned my passport before my trip. My dad's revenge was brutal. When I went through my bag to double-check everything before our flight, I realized my passport wasn't there. At first, I thought maybe I misplaced it, so I tore the entire house apart. Drawers, shelves, even the laundry baskets. 45 minutes later, I was sweating, panicking, and close to tears. It was just gone. That's when Susan and Nadia waltzed into my room with these fake sweet voices and asked, "Lose something?" I immediately felt something was off, but in desperation, I admitted I couldn't find my passport anywhere. That's when Susan tossed something on my bed. It was my passport, or at least what was left of it. Half burned, charred along the edges, completely ruined. She smirked and asked, "Was this what you were looking for?" I froze. My brain couldn't even process it at first. When the shock finally wore off, I decided I wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of watching me break down. I calmly set the ruined passport aside, stood up, shut the door in their faces, locked it, and then I collapsed into tears. Dad wasn't home. He was out picking up clothes for the trip. I texted him everything that happened, even attached a photo of the burned passport. Within 20 minutes, I heard him storming into the house. His voice shook the walls as he screamed at Susan and Nadia, calling them psychos and ordering them out. He said he'd already made one mistake when he ignored the first time they mistreated me, and he wasn't about to repeat it just because he once loved Susan. Of course, they immediately tried to fake cry and blame me. Their story? That I'd supposedly left a lit cigarette on my dresser, and that's how my passport caught fire. Which is insane. I don't even smoke. At that point, I came downstairs because I couldn't let them spin lies like that. Dad looked at me and said I was just in time because he had something planned. I assumed he was about to call the police, but no. He went into his office and came back with a stack of papers. Nadia's face went pale the second she saw them. Then, without saying a word, Dad ripped the documents in half right in front of Susan. Turns out those papers were for Nadia's student loan. She needed Dad to co-sign so she could pay for college since Susan hadn't saved a dime for her. Dad had been ready to help, not anymore. That was his revenge. My passport for her college dream. Fair trade, honestly. Within an hour, Susan and Nadia were gone. They begged, pleaded, even got on their knees, but Dad didn't budge. Now, since the moment they left, they've been spamming me with texts, Nadia especially. She keeps begging me to convince Dad to reconsider, promising she'll do anything to make up for it. She claims they never knew Dad was going to co-sign her loan, and that they just lashed out because they felt excluded. I finally replied once. I reminded them that they've gone on plenty of mother-daughter trips without us, so why is it unfair when Dad and I wanted one international trip with Dad, without my stepmother and stepsister? Their getaways usually last only 2 to 3 days, somewhere nearby, while ours was supposed to be 10 full days in India. That's a big difference. So here I am asking, am I really the bad guy for wanting one international trip with my dad without my stepmother and stepsister? Well, before I continue, I'll just say what I think the answer is. No, not at all. This situation seems clear. I wasn't wrong. I wanted time with my dad, especially on my 18th birthday, and especially since it was in honor of my late mom. What Susan and Nadia did was cruel and manipulative, and it says more about them than about me. My dad, he's the one I feel bad for. He fell for a woman who clearly didn't respect me, and by extension, didn't really love him the way she should have.
Update 2. A lot of people asked why we didn't call the cops after they destroyed my passport. The truth? It didn't even cross my mind at first. I was in shock, panicking, crying. And honestly, what would it have done? They would have just claimed it was an accident, dragged it out forever, and nothing would change.
We didn't want that mess. Others also asked why I wasn't in college yet. I graduated high school last year and decided to take a gap year to figure myself out. I worked a few jobs, interned in journalism, and gained some experience in the field I want to study. Now I'm applying to schools, and luckily my grandparents have already promised to cover my tuition, so my dad doesn't have to stress about me. Nadia's situation was completely different, which is why Dad was planning to co-sign her student loan. But after what happened, well, you already know how that ended. As for our trip, today was supposed to be our flight to India. Instead, we stayed home and watched old movies we used to love. It wasn't the same, but honestly, it helped. I finally blocked both Susan and Nadia, and I don't regret it. They don't deserve my sympathy. You were all right. I was only second-guessing myself because I'd been missing my mom and was in a very emotional state. But they betrayed me for no reason, and whatever happens to them now, they absolutely brought on themselves. Update 3. It's been 4 days since my last post, and today Dad came home from work with big news. He filed for divorce. Afterward, we finally had the conversation we'd been avoiding for far too long. He admitted that he'd been selfish. He loved Susan and tried to convince himself it would work out, even when her behavior, and Nadia's, clearly proved otherwise. Instead of trying to repair things with me, they simply shut me out completely. That's not family. That's not love. Dad told me he finally realized he'd been clinging to something toxic and that it was damaging both of us. He deserves better. I deserve better. Maybe he did love her, but it was obvious she didn't love him enough to even tolerate me, and that's not the kind of woman he should spend his life with. Update 3. The reason Susan never truly accepted me was simple. She could never see me as part of her family. Deep down, she probably knew that for Dad, I would always come first, and that neither she nor Nadia could ever replace me. That jealousy and insecurity made her bitter, and eventually it poisoned everything. Dad may never fully understand why their behavior shifted so dramatically, because before the wedding they treated me kindly, but the moment the vows were said, it's like they became different people overnight. Dad admitted he ignored the signs, hoping things would somehow settle, but the damage was already done. He told me he's finished pretending. We're not a happy family, and there's no point acting like one. That same day, after meeting with his lawyer, he filed for divorce. Later, he apologized for everything I'd had to endure because of his choices, and we just hugged. Some might call him a flawed father, but to me, he's the best dad I could ever ask for. Sure, he made mistakes and sometimes thought only of himself, but every mistake was outweighed by 10 good things he did for me. I love him, and I always will. Update 4. A few days later, it became official. Susan was served divorce papers. Dad came home early from work and locked himself in his office. I could hear him shouting into the phone, and it had me worried. Hours later, he finally explained. Susan had called, threatening to ruin him if he went through with the divorce. She promised to spread lies, throw accusations, and destroy his reputation. The first time she caught him off guard at work, but once he was home, he recorded the call. When she realized he had proof, she flipped out, accused him of blackmail, and turned the whole thing into chaos. Dad didn't back down. He told her if she tried to drag his name through the mud, he'd make sure she would regret it. From her voice, he could tell she was shaken. He said the process will start soon, and once it's finalized, he and I will finally take that trip to India together. He promised me. For now, we just hope she doesn't create more problems. But honestly, with the evidence I have, including the destroyed passport, she knows she's fighting a losing battle. Update 5. Hi again, quick update because I'm super busy. The divorce is officially finalized, and the outcome? Honestly, Dad hit the jackpot. Susan walked away with nothing. No alimony, no settlement, no ridiculous child support she tried to claim out of nowhere. She fought dirty, but it didn't work. So now it's just us. We kept everything, and for the first time in a long time, life feels calm. I already have my new passport, and Dad and I have started planning our India trip again. This time, it's really happening. I can't even describe how excited I am. More importantly, I'm genuinely happy now. Thank you all for your support along the way.
I let my sister-in-law throw her baby shower at my house, but then she tried to kick me out of my own home during the party just to impress one of her wealthy friends. I told her husband what happened, and that ended up leading to their divorce. Now she's raising the baby alone. I'm 32, married for 3 years. My husband, 35, and I have been together for 5 years, but he's currently working out of town, so we're basically in a long-distance situation. He comes home every other weekend. We recently bought a beautiful new house right next to my parents' place, so it's convenient for all of us. It's pretty big for just me, but I love the space. At our housewarming, everyone complimented it, especially my sister-in-law, Carrie, 32. She couldn't stop gushing about it. Carrie and I aren't super close, but we've always gotten along. A couple weeks ago, she asked if she could have her baby shower at my house. I agreed without hesitation. She was pregnant, I didn't want to be rude, and honestly, I thought it might be nice to socialize a bit, since I spend a lot of time alone. She said she didn't want to waste money renting a venue when I had such a perfect home for it. Her own house is fine, but smaller and not as impressive. I took her compliments at face value and agreed. For 2 weeks, she came over almost every day to plan things. I even took a day off work to help her. I work in finance, definitely not in event planning, but she kept treating me like her personal party coordinator. Still, I didn't mind because I thought this would bring us closer. I was wrong. On the day of the shower, I spent hours helping the decorators set everything up. Carrie arrived early, thanked me, acted totally normal. Then 15 minutes before guests were supposed to arrive, she looked at me and asked, "So where are you planning to spend the next couple of hours?" I was stunned. At first, I thought she was joking. I mean, it's my house. I was dressed for the event, had bought her a gift, and had been involved in planning everything. I asked if she was serious, and she calmly explained that I wasn't on the guest list. Apparently, she'd never intended for me to be there. She claimed she thought I was just helping out, like some kind of hired planner. She told me the shower was for close family and friends only, and that unfortunately, I didn't make the cut. She even asked me to leave before her guests arrived so I wouldn't cause a scene. I was furious, humiliated, and honestly heartbroken. I stormed outside to call my husband, but he was busy at work and couldn't pick up. I couldn't hold it in anymore. I decided to call Carrie's husband, Jim, 33. I don't know him well. He's quiet and reserved, but I told him everything. How I'd let her use my house, help plan the whole thing, and then how she tried to kick me out of my own home for her little exclusive party. He was silent for a long time after listening. I apologized for dumping all this on him, but I couldn't keep it in. I was so hurt. Jim finally said, very calmly, that I had nothing to apologize for, and that under no circumstances should I be leaving my own house. It would have been ridiculous for me to leave, and Jim told me he was on his way over. He didn't want things to escalate between me and Carrie, and he didn't want her getting worked up while pregnant. That sounded reasonable, so I waited. 15 minutes later, before any of her guests arrived, Jim showed up. Carrie looked like she'd seen a ghost when he walked in. As soon as I heard the doorbell, I went back inside. We all stood in the living room, and Jim calmly but firmly told me I was absolutely welcome to stay for the shower. This was my house after all. Carrie tried to argue, but he gave her a sharp look, and she went silent. She spent the whole evening glaring at me like she wanted me to vanish. I kept my cool and carried myself with dignity, but I quietly decided right then I was done with her. I even thought about canceling the whole event out of spite, but I'd put too much time and effort into helping set it up. So I endured the evening and promised myself I'd never deal with Carrie again. After the shower ended, Jim apologized again for her behavior. Carrie didn't even look at me. He actually apologized for that too, saying she had no right to treat me that way. She was clearly bitter and thought I had forced myself into her special day, which was honestly insulting given it was happening under my own roof. Later that night, I told my husband everything. He was furious and wanted to call his sister immediately, but I asked him not to, at least not that night. I just wanted peace. But peace didn't last. The very next morning, my in-laws called me fuming. Apparently, when Carrie and Jim got home, they had a huge blowout fight because Jim knew what she'd done to me. Now, Jim had packed up and said he was done. He stopped speaking to Carrie entirely and even cut off communication with my in-laws. That shocked everyone, since Jim had always been close to her family. Their parents had even been old family friends. But suddenly, his side of the family blocked Carrie's parents everywhere. Social media, phone, everything. And yet, somehow, this was all my fault. According to Carrie and my in-laws, if I just kept quiet and gone along with her plan, none of this would have happened. They actually blamed me for ruining her marriage. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Carrie humiliated me in my house, and I was the one being painted as the villain? I lost it. I told them straight up, I am not taking the blame for any of this. Carrie behaved horribly. I generously allowed her to host an event at my home for free, and in return, she tried to humiliate me by kicking me out of my own house, all because she didn't think I was close enough family. Excuse me, I'm literally her brother's wife. I reminded them that if my husband had been home, Carrie never would have dared to treat me that way. And I don't regret telling Jim the truth. He was the only reasonable adult in this mess. If he decided enough was enough and chose to walk away from his marriage, I trust his judgment. That's his choice, and it's not on me. But my in-laws won't stop harassing me. They keep saying I've ruined a family, and Carrie's baby will grow up without a father because of me. Honestly, that's just emotional blackmail. I'm close to blocking them completely, but the only reason I haven't is because sometimes their words do get in my head. They make me doubt myself, even though I know deep down I didn't do anything wrong. My husband, thankfully, is fully on my side. He told me I did nothing wrong, and he'll be the one to explain to his parents that Carrie caused this, not me. He says they should be supporting her instead of attacking me. But I'm just exhausted. I don't feel guilty at all, but they won't leave me alone, and all I want is for this drama to finally be over. Honestly, I still don't even understand why it mattered so much to Carrie that I wasn't at her baby shower. It never made sense to me. So, was I really wrong for telling her husband the truth about how badly she treated me? You can make up your own minds, but personally, I think I did the right thing. I don't see any reason why I should be the scapegoat here. Yes, it's tragic if their baby ends up growing up without a father, but if they couldn't fix their marriage anyway, that outcome was inevitable sooner or later. And let's be real, Carrie had zero interest in resolving things. If she had been willing to apologize, maybe there would have been a chance to work things out. Instead, she doubled down and pushed all the blame on me. That's just insane.
Update 1. Hi again. It's been almost a week since the baby shower, and Carrie and Jim are officially getting divorced. This isn't speculation. Jim already announced it on his socials. I didn't think things would unravel this quickly, but apparently he's already filed and the process has started. He moved back in with his parents, and they've been living apart ever since. I wasn't sure if I should even reach out because I honestly felt guilty, but after talking with my husband, we agreed that someone from the family should at least check in, especially since Jim hadn't blocked us. Clearly, he left that door open for a reason, so I sent him a message, just saying I was sorry that things had turned out this way. Not an apology for causing it, more like expressing sympathy. He actually reassured me, told me not to blame myself because their marriage had been hanging by a thread for a long time. After that, I asked him directly, why did Carrie hate the idea of me being there so much? Because the only close relatives excuse never added up. She'd invited plenty of people who weren't even family, people I knew she wasn't close with. So what was the real reason? Well, he told me, and wow. The truth was, Carrie had been desperate to impress one particular guest, an old school friend of hers who'd married into a very wealthy family. Carrie's been planning to start a business after the baby, and she was hoping this woman's wealthy husband might invest in it. Her entire baby shower plan was basically a performance for this one guest. And here's the kicker. She wanted to pretend my house was hers. That's why she didn't want me around. She thought she could host the event, claim the house was hers, and put on this illusion of being more successful than she really is. Obviously, she couldn't pull that off with me standing right there. As it turned out, that important friend didn't even show up because she got sick that day. But the fact remains, Carrie was perfectly willing to lie, humiliate me, and use me just to keep up appearances. When Jim found out, he confronted her at home. She admitted it openly, like it was no big deal to fake an entire lifestyle just to impress someone from high school. Jim told her straight up she owed me an apology for treating me like trash after I'd been generous enough to host. She flat out refused, and that fight cracked open everything else. According to Jim, this wasn't new behavior. For the last couple of years, Carrie's been obsessed with pretending they're wealthier than they are, staging things for social media, putting on a front for acquaintances. He said it all started not long after their wedding, when some of her friends made snide comments about how modest their wedding was compared to others. Since then, she's been living in this fantasy of trying to look rich. Hearing this honestly blew my mind, but it also made everything click into place. Honestly, I think all those comments from her friends really got under Carrie's skin. But she's a grown woman, not a teenager. She shouldn't still be this obsessed with what other people think. Real friends don't mock you for not living a flashy lifestyle. If they do, maybe they're not worth keeping around. The thing is, Carrie and Jim aren't struggling at all. They live a perfectly normal, comfortable life. Sure, they're not wealthy, but they're fine. Jim works in real estate, and Carrie has a steady job at a marketing firm. She even had plans to launch her own business after the baby. If anything, she should have been saving up instead of spending recklessly. But Carrie's been fixated on projecting this glamorous image they simply can't afford. Jim said he tried countless times to explain to her that their life is good enough as it is, that they don't need to impress anyone. But she just brushed him off. Instead, she kept buying things without talking to him first, kept putting up a front. That put a constant strain on their marriage. He admitted he used to ignore it because he loved her so much, but with a baby on the way, he couldn't look past it anymore. It wasn't just about money anymore. It was about the kind of future they'd be able to give their child. After the baby shower fight, Jim snapped. He told me even if I hadn't called him that day, he would have left sooner or later. The baby shower incident just sped things up. He doesn't blame me for anything, and honestly, I feel lighter knowing that. My husband and I talked it over too. He feels sorry for Carrie, of course, but he also thinks Jim wouldn't have walked away unless he'd thought it through. Jim was a good husband, and if he reached his breaking point, that says a lot. I do feel bad for Carrie, especially since she's pregnant, but at the end of the day, she dug herself into this. She's in her 30s, still acting like she's in high school, still letting shallow people dictate how she feels about her own life. She needs therapy more than she needs new designer bags. I honestly hope they figure something out, if only for their baby's sake, because growing up in a broken home is tough. For now, though, I'm stepping back. I've decided to block Carrie and my in-laws for the time being, not out of spite, but because I don't see anything good from staying involved. My husband agrees. We'll give them space and focus on our own lives. Update 2. So my husband just got back a couple of hours ago and he filled me in. He's been in touch with Jim these past few days, and apparently Jim is open to giving their marriage another shot, but only if Carrie is willing to apologize and agree to go to therapy. My husband's been trying to get that message across to her, but so far she hasn't responded. His parents said she's avoiding everyone right now, just isolating because she's so upset, which honestly is understandable, but the ball's in her court now. As for some of the comments on my last post, a lot of people called me selfish, saying my husband and I were greedy and should have been financially supporting Carrie and Jim. I honestly don't know how people came to that conclusion, but let me clear the air. We bought this house fair and square because we could afford it. If it hadn't been within our budget, we wouldn't have bought it. And for the record, Jim and Carrie are not broke. They have stable incomes. Acting like they need our charity is just insulting to them. Also, my husband and I are in a very similar financial situation to Jim and Carrie, so I don't understand why they'd need our help or why anyone would think they do. It's a bit odd, but since some of you brought it up, I wanted to clarify. Some people didn't like that I said I hope they reconcile and stay together, claiming Jim deserves better. Maybe he does, but ultimately it's his choice. I don't get why so many people feel the need to pour hate here, call me names, or call Jim a pushover without even knowing him. They love each other, despite all their problems, and they're having a child together. That's a big deal. They can't just walk away from each other and move on, given the circumstances. So yes, I wanted and still want things to work out for them. That's all I wanted to say for now. Update 3. Hi everyone, it's been almost 3 weeks since my last post. I just wanted to share that Jim and Carrie have decided to reconcile and try to work things out. I'm really happy for them, even though Carrie and I still aren't talking. I found out from my husband that they've agreed to attend family therapy for a couple of months to see how things go. They'll still live separately for now, and when the baby arrives, they'll co-parent together for the first few months. If things go well, they plan to move back in together. I'm genuinely happy for them. I know this isn't what a lot of people wanted to hear. Many were hoping Jim would just leave her, but he's going to do what he thinks is right, and everyone else will have to respect that.
I ruined my ex-boyfriend's life over 20 years ago, and I just made sure it stays that way. When I was in college in the 90s, I met Jake through mutual friends. He was 23 at the time. He had already graduated and was planning to move across the country to pursue graduate school. I was also planning a move, with friends, to a city just an hour and a half away from where he was going. We had a lot in common. We fell in love, and it felt like fate. Both of us planning to move 4,000 kilometers, and almost to the same place. Jake had 2 sisters and a younger brother. They were all great people, and I got along with them right away. Since Jake was in grad school and I was working, I usually visited him on weekends. He rented a house with 2 roommates from his program. We were young, didn't have much money, but we had fun. We went on cheap dates and spent a lot of time at home. Jake bred and sold small animals. It was part of his studies. He was studying animal science, so being surrounded by animals was normal for him, and honestly, I didn't mind it. I met the wife of his academic advisor, Mary. She was around 50 and worked in the university administration. A wonderful woman. We often had lunch together when I visited. In fact, I connected with people from his program even more easily than he did. But about 2 years into the relationship, something strange happened. One day we were lying in bed at his place, partially undressed, and he suddenly said that he was bothered by the fact that I had gained weight, and that it was becoming harder for him to feel attracted to me. Not a word about health, just that he found me less attractive. I sat up and calmly replied, "Maybe you should make sure I have proper food when I visit you, instead of just crackers and cheese." I had gained maybe 4 kilograms since we met. I wore the same clothing size, and even at 23, I wasn't going to tolerate that kind of nonsense. I didn't argue. It was his problem, not mine. So I just asked, "So what's your solution?" He looked me blankly and said, "I think you should try to lose weight." I replied, "No, I'm not going to do that. So what are you going to do?" He said, "Probably nothing. I just wanted to tell you how I feel." "Great, thanks." I got dressed, went to sleep, and left the next day like usual. We kept dating. But about 3 months later, he called and said he wanted to break up after nearly 3 years together. The reason? And I quote, "You're not scientific enough." I thought, what kind of nonsense is that? He seriously claimed that he couldn't talk to me about his work without using scientific animal terminology. I said, "That's ridiculous. What's the real reason?" But he insisted that was the reason. A month later, he came to return my things, and I made him tell the truth. Eventually, he gave in. It turned out he had been seeing one of his students. Let's call her Mac. She was 19.
He was 26, and he was her instructor. I exploded. I yelled at him to get out. My roommate even threatened to throw him off the second floor if he didn't leave, and he left. As soon as the door closed behind him, I broke down, from rage to hysterical laughter. I had seen Mac before, and suddenly it all clicked. At a barbecue at his place once, she had spilled something on her pants. Jake asked if I could lend her a pair of sweatpants. I couldn't. I wore a size 44-46, and she was significantly bigger. And suddenly everything made sense. His comment about my weight was never about me. He just wanted me to break up with him, because he was a coward. He liked a completely different type of girl, but didn't have the courage to say it. But you know what really got to me? He said it at night, when I was 150 kilometers from home, after we had been intimate. Did he really think I would just snap, turn around, and drive home in the middle of the night? After that, I messaged his roommates. I thanked them for everything and told them we had broken up. And they already knew. They said they had demanded he tell me the truth, otherwise they would have told me themselves. That's why he came up with that nonsense about me not being scientific enough. One of the roommates, George, was a very sweet and attractive guy. He offered to bring my things over and said, "Come over this weekend. We'll have some drinks, relax." The kind of thing Jake never wanted to spend money on. I agreed. I came over. Jake wasn't home. George let me in, and that's when things got interesting. I started taking photos of all his animals because I knew one important thing. He had an animal that was on the endangered species list, and you couldn't legally keep it without a permit. All he had to do was file paperwork and pay $25, but he always said, "I don't want the government in my business." I photographed everything, the conditions, the cages, and another animal that was completely illegal to keep in that state. It was right by the window, visible from the street. Then George and I went into town. We got back around midnight, and we made sure Jake and Max saw us. Me in a short dress, a little drunk, George almost carrying me. We were loud on purpose, laughing, joking, even pretending there was something going on between us so they could hear. I spent the night in George's room. He behaved like a gentleman, but a few times walked out into the hallway just in his boxers. Pure coincidence, of course. In the morning, as I was leaving, Jake said, "You don't have to act like a..." I slowly ate a donut in a wrinkled dress with messy hair. George kissed me on the top of my head. Max sat there not knowing where to look. I smiled and said, "Enjoy my leftovers," and left. At the time, I thought that was my revenge. But no, that was just the beginning. The next day, I developed the film. Yes, the good old days. And immediately called the Department of Natural Resources. I reported everything, the animals, the conditions, the overcrowding, and especially the two that were illegal to keep in that state. I simply asked how to properly file a report, and then I did.
I destroyed my ex-boyfriend's life more than 20 years ago, and I just made sure it stays that way. As it turned out, Jake wasn't liked, not by his classmates, not even by his own roommates. But me? People liked me. George and another roommate decided to take things further. They filed a complaint with the university about a teaching assistant who was sleeping with his student and giving her preferential treatment. That same night we went bar hopping. They told the story to everyone they knew. The program was small, and the news spread fast. I made another move, too. I called Mary, his advisor's wife, and I told her directly. He admitted himself that he's sleeping with a student. I even had his emails where he confirmed it. I sent them to her. Mary was furious. She immediately passed everything to her husband, Jake's advisor.
And then it all started. A couple of weeks later, George calls me, emotional. "They're here, inspectors. They're taking the animals." Mac was at home, and trying to save the situation, she said, "All the animals belong to Jake." That automatically cleared the roommates of responsibility. The inspectors knew exactly where to look. They were tipped off about the back window, where the most problematic animal was, the one that was almost never legal to keep. Since George was on the lease, he had the right to let them in. All the animals were kept in shared spaces. The inspectors worked for several hours. Then they came back with a warrant. They took all the animals and searched Jake's room. The only thing they left were a few guppies in a tank. Now, the most painful part for him. Graduate students live off grants, and he had just received a federal grant around the time we broke up. I called them and simply asked, "How do I report that someone with a federal grant is under investigation for illegal animal possession?" The result? He lost the grant and had to pay back nearly $30,000. He will never be able to get federal funding again. He wasn't jailed. The animals were in decent condition. But he lost all his animals, paid about $15,000 in fines. 2 animals were transferred to a wildlife center. The university didn't stay out of it either. He lost his stipend, was fired from teaching, essentially had his academic career destroyed. And all because of one thing. He was sleeping with a student. He couldn't even wait 4 weeks until the end of the course, when it would have been technically allowed. His arrogance destroyed him. A few months later, I wrote to his sisters, told them I missed them. They replied and told me he had lied to the family, said I broke up with him because of distance. I just forwarded him his own email, where he said he had fallen in love with Mac. And that settled everything. I moved on, finished my studies, built a career. And you know what I do now? I help scientists and doctors explain complex things in simple terms. Ironic, right? And him? He married Mac, 2 kids, went back to breeding animals. 20 years passed, and one day I'm giving a lecture at a university, 250 people in the room. And suddenly I hear, "Hey, long time no see." I turn around. It's him, Jake. I pretended I didn't recognize him. "Sorry, do I know you?" He said, "It's me, Jake." I paused and said, I guess my memory just erased you," and walked away. Later, I found out he was there for a job interview for a teaching position. They were seriously considering hiring him. And then I said just one sentence. "It's strange he's still teaching after what happened at University X." That was enough. They checked and found everything. The scandal with the student, the lost grant, the investigation, the old complaints. And you know what? He didn't get the job. Karma. Sometimes it works perfectly. And my conclusion? If the person who's supposed to love you humiliates you because of your appearance, the problem isn't you. The problem is them.
I stopped a kidnapping while delivering pizza. I work as a pizza delivery driver, and one night turned into one of the strangest and most intense experiences of my life. It was a crazy shift, non-stop orders, driving all over the city without a single real break. I had been drinking water all evening because of the heat, and of course, I didn't make time to use the restroom. By the time I got close to my next delivery, the urge hit me like a truck. Luckily, I was nearly at the customer's address. I thought I'd drop the pizza off quickly, then deal with the problem. But when I pulled up, things immediately felt wrong. I'd been to that neighborhood before, even that house,
But this time, all the windows were dark, not even the glow of a TV inside. The entire street was eerily quiet. This was a college area, so sure, not many students were around in July, but still, somebody had ordered this pizza. I wasn't about to step out of the car and walk up to a pitch-black house. It was around 9:30 p.m., still hot outside, even though the sun had set hours ago. My car's AC barely worked, and the pizza boxes weren't helping. I called the number on the order. At first, all I heard was heavy, uneven breathing, then a shaky, "Hello?" I tried to keep it professional. "Hey, I'm outside with your pizza, but it doesn't look like anyone's home." The voice gasped, I'm not there. Not yet." Annoyed, and very distracted by my full bladder, I snapped back harsher than I should have. "Well, if you're not here, I'll have to cancel the order. You were supposed to pay cash. Next time, plan better." Almost immediately, I regretted it. The voice grew clearer. It was a young woman, maybe in her early 20s. Out of breath, she explained, "Oh my God, I was running home. I almost didn't hear you. I just switched off my AirPods. Is this better? I lost track of time at work, but I knew you'd be coming, so I'm literally sprinting back right now. Please, please don't leave. I'm starving and I don't have a car. Just 5 minutes, I promise." Hearing her voice jogged my memory. I had delivered here before, and she was always polite. Now I felt like a jerk for barking at her. I told her it was fine, that I'd wait, and hung up. But the bathroom situation was reaching emergency levels. No trees, no hidden corners. And like an idiot, I had tossed out an empty bottle earlier. The only option was the row of bushes by her front walkway. No lights outside, no one around, my car parked across the street, and thankfully, my job didn't require a uniform. I figured I'd be quick and no one would notice. I hurried to the thickest bush right near the front door, unzipped, and finally started to relieve myself. But almost immediately, I realized something was off. The sound wasn't right. It wasn't hitting dirt. It was solid. Before I could process it, a muffled male voice barked, "What the hell?" And a man suddenly burst out of the bush. He ran past me, wiping himself off. I must have hit him directly. My eyes adjusted enough to make out his shape, build, and clothes, but he disappeared before I could react. A minute later, I heard the screech of tires down the street. That's when it clicked. That girl had said she was running home, alone, at night, and some guy had been hiding in her bushes by the door. If I hadn't been desperate enough to relieve myself right there, I don't even want to think what might have happened. I was so stunned that I didn't even zip up. I just stood there, frozen, trying to process what the hell had just happened. The reality of it was so terrifying that my brain refused to accept it, desperately searching for some logical explanation that would make it all seem normal. I wondered maybe the bushes led to a backyard and only looked like they were up against the house. Maybe they covered an open basement window or something. But then that voice in my head screamed, "Dude, that guy was wearing a hoodie in 90-degree Fahrenheit. That is not normal. He's bad news. You're in real danger." The thought that I'd been just a couple of steps away from some man hiding in the bushes outside a young woman's home at night sent a chill down my spine. My fight-or-flight response completely broke down because instead of running, my dumb brain decided to do the absolute worst thing possible. I walked closer to investigate. There had to be a reasonable explanation, right? Some non-creepy reason for a guy in a hoodie to be crouched in the dark shrubs? I circled around, turned on my phone flashlight, and aimed it behind the bushes. But if something looks scary in the dark, trust me, shining a beam of light on it can make it 100 times worse. That's when I saw it. A bag. It was an old, beat-up drawstring backpack, a little damp from, well, yeah, I'd accidentally splashed it. Still in a fog of shock, I reached for it, thinking, okay, maybe this explains it. Maybe he's homeless. Maybe he was just resting here. But when I opened the bag, reality hit me like a truck. Inside were a sharp hunting knife, a roll of duct tape, and a bottle of pills. At that moment, every illusion I'd been clinging to shattered. My body flipped into full survival mode. Adrenaline and instinct kicked in like never before. Gone was the frozen, confused idiot. I became laser-focused on one single goal: get to the car. I dropped the bag like it was on fire, bolted across the street, jumped into my car, and floored it before the door had even shut. I didn't stop until I hit a red light several blocks away. Only then did I pull over in the lot of a 24-hour pharmacy, shaking uncontrollably, trying to catch my breath. When I finally calmed down enough to think clearly, the first question hit me. Do I call the cops first, or the girl who lives there? I mulled it over for what felt like 10 seconds, but when I glanced at the clock, an entire hour had passed. My brain was still scrambled. Eventually, I told myself, all right, I'm safe in my locked car with the engine running. If anything goes down, I can drive away. But she might not know what's waiting for her. So I started dialing her number. Then a horrifying thought stopped me cold. What if there is no girl? Sure, I was 90% sure I'd delivered here before, but what if I was mistaken? What if the girl on the phone was just bait, a setup to lure me into a trap? Every pizza delivery driver alive has heard of the evil genius case. I replayed the phone call in my head. She'd been panting, said she wasn't home, begged me not to leave. The whole thing was weird, way too weird. Nope, can't risk it. Call the cops first. So I dialed 911. The operator was calm, professional, thank God, because by then I was completely falling apart. I kept rambling, tripping over my words, trying to explain 3 different points at once. You have to get there before the girl arrives. He wasn't waiting for me, he was waiting for her. But then again, maybe she doesn't even exist. But I did talk to someone on the phone, so if she is real, you need to find her because she has no idea what's happening. And listen, I only checked part of the bushes. There could be more than one of them. Oh, and you'll know the guy when you see him because, I peed all over him. Not on purpose, just... Long story. Finally, the dispatcher told me to stop talking and just stay on the line. And then, her number popped up on my phone. Incoming call. I couldn't answer without disconnecting 911, so I ignored it. Seconds later, a text came through. Hey, I'm here, but I don't see you. I blurted it out to the operator, and they said the officers were just a couple of minutes away from the address. But my stomach twisted with guilt. Rationally, I knew the odds of her being some kind of scammer were tiny. Much more likely, she was a real girl walking straight into a nightmare. I unmuted the line and said, I'm going back. I can't just sit here. They definitely didn't like that answer, but I had already turned the car around. My heart was pounding out of my chest, and the whole way I was muttering under my breath, shh, fuck, fuck, fuck. And then I saw her.
The lawnmower theft. A guy from a lawn care service stole my lawnmower and disappeared. I occasionally hire local workers through a third-party app to mow my lawn. I've never had any issues, until recently, when I decided to mow it myself and realized the mower was gone. I usually keep it on the back porch. After checking my security footage, I was shocked to see the last guy I'd hired stealing my brand new mower, the one I'd only used twice, and trying to sneak it out through my neighbor's yard. The idiot must have thought my camera had a narrow angle. I reported it to the service, and they confirmed it was theft. They told me I needed to file a police report so they could help track the guy down and recover the mower. Update 1. The company gave me the thief's direct contact. His excuse? He claimed he thought the mower was broken and decided to help me out by removing it as junk, assuming that's why I hired them. Now he says someone stole his trailer with my mower inside it. I'm currently on the phone with the sheriff, filing a report. The sheriff said the amount qualifies as grand theft since it's over $500. He contacted the guy and gave him 24 hours to either return the mower or pay the full cost. Otherwise, it becomes a criminal case and a warrant will be issued for his arrest. Small-town sheriffs don't mess around. I also posted the theft video on the neighborhood app Nextdoor. Someone messaged me saying they knew his mom and sister and would reach out to them. A few others even found his Instagram. Update 2. Things are getting wild. Someone shared the Nextdoor video on Facebook
and now people who know the guy personally are clowning on him. Apparently, he'd been pretending online to be a successful entrepreneur and self-made influencer, and now everyone's tagging him under the stolen mower post. I honestly didn't want to ruin his life. I just wanted my mower back. But then his mother contacted me, begging me to remove the video because it was hurting his business and reputation. I couldn't help but laugh. I told her exactly what my next steps were and explained that fixing her son's mess wasn't her responsibility. I sent her the invoice so she could forward it to him. He still had 23 hours left. After that, arrest warrant. Then he deleted all his social media accounts. Every tag turned gray. It's 9:47 p.m. now. I'll call him at 7 a.m. to see what he plans to do. Honestly, I doubt this ends well. Update 3. Woke up to 36 missed calls between 1 and 4 a.m. Thank God for Do Not Disturb mode and spam blocking. When I tried calling back, the call went straight to voicemail. Then I tried from my Google Voice number and it went through. So yeah, he blocked my main number. I also spoke to his mom again. She's changed her tune now. Said she's tried reaching him too, but he's ignoring her calls. She finally told me, do what you have to do. He's really about to run from the law over a damned lawnmower. Update 4. Finally reached him through his sister. He said he doesn't have the $579 to replace the mower and asked if I could convince the sheriff to give him 2 weeks to get the money together, which is, by the way, an admission of guilt. I told him to borrow from someone or ask his family because I wasn't dropping the charges. He's got 9 hours left. Tick-tock. Update 5. The sheriff sent a deputy over to inspect the property, take my statement, and collect documents from the app that hired him. Guess what? The deputy ran a background check, and it turns out the guy already has a criminal record in another county for theft. They're done waiting. The warrant's being issued. I don't feel bad for him at all. He dug his own hole, now he can sit in it. Then out of nowhere, I get a message from him using a new number. I took screenshots and forwarded them to the sheriff. Here's what he wrote. Hey man, it's Dushan. You posted that video of me taking your mower. I didn't mean any harm. I thought it didn't work and tried to help myself. Lots of my clients asked me to take old gear off their hands. Yours didn't even start when I tried it. I'm not paying for something you just left in your yard. This is your fault, not mine. And about that sheriff thing, I've got a great lawyer. God's on my side. You act like it's the end of the world, but I'll rise again. Good luck, bro. Yeah, the dude has completely lost it. I stopped responding altogether and forwarded the messages to his mother and sister. He seriously needs help. Then he sent another text. You think this is a joke, man? I don't care about you or the cops. It's all a game to me. People like you always try to bring down guys like me when we're rising up. You'll never understand my hustle. I live this every day. I could buy 10 lawnmowers if I wanted. Yours was trash anyway. Can't even afford a John Deere like a real man. You're a clown. Always will be. That's probably the last update, unless the sheriff tells me he's been arrested. If that happens, I'll post his mugshot. For now, I just bought a new mower, an electric one I can keep inside the house this time. Thanks to everyone for the support, jokes, and laughs. You honestly helped me stay sane through this mess. Final update. The sheriff called. The arrest warrant is active. If his plates get scanned or he's pulled over, he's done. Police don't have his current address, only his mom's. But I gotta say, the sheriff's office handled this incredibly fast. Not sure if I should tell his mother. Oh, and I treated myself today. Bought a new electric mower with a leaf blower, trimmer, and quick charger. It's quiet, clean, and stays in my garage. A corporate lawyer friend read the service's terms and told me I have a solid case. He's taking it pro bono. He even thinks the company will settle out of court to avoid bad publicity. And get this, someone said the thief is in Texas now. Looks like the guy really ran off over a lawnmower.
My ex-wife is trying to win me back by using our daughters. Doesn't sound too serious at first, right? Yeah, that's what I thought too. But as much as I'd love to tell my ex to go to hell and never see her again, we share 2 daughters and joint custody.
So completely cutting her out of my life just isn't possible, not unless I walk away from my kids too, which I'd never do. We got married young, 20 years old, dating for 3 years before that. Our daughters were born during the first year of marriage. After the second birth, my ex had complications that made it difficult for her to get pregnant again. I didn't care. I was just grateful she made it through safely, and that we already had 2 beautiful little girls to love. The marriage lasted 9 years. It ended when I filed for divorce after discovering she cheated. I have zero tolerance for betrayal. I refuse to make myself miserable for something I didn't cause. Maybe it sounds strange, but my love for her died the exact moment I learned about her affair in detail. So no, this isn't some story about a man who can't let go. I moved on 7 years ago. Hell, I don't even hate her. I just don't care. Whatever happens in her life means nothing to me, unless it directly affects our kids. The problem is, I seem to be the only one who's actually moved on. My ex, her family, and even our daughters keep trying to push us back together, even though I've made it crystal clear that I have absolutely no desire to ever be with her again. Maybe the fact that I stayed single for years after the divorce gave them false hope. But honestly, I just wasn't ready to jump into anything new. My daughters were my top priority. Plus, I had my own emotional mess to sort through after her betrayal, which, thankfully, I managed with help from friends, family, and therapy. My relationship with my daughters is great. We don't fight, we don't yell, and they're not rebellious or dramatic. Everything's been peaceful, except for one issue. They know their mother cheated. She told them herself about 3 years ago. Since then, I think she's been feeding them her version of events. I've asked her countless times to stop. It doesn't help anyone, least of all the girls. But instead of stopping, she just got sneakier about it. Since the divorce, she hasn't dated anyone, or even tried. I guess she thinks that makes her look noble. But honestly, I find it insulting. She could cheat on me while we were married, but now she's suddenly living like a saint? Whatever. That's her problem, not mine. For years, I could ignore the little comments my daughters made about their mom. How good she looks now, how happy she seems, the photos she just happened to show them where she's clearly dressed up to impress. But lately, things have gotten worse. Why? Because I started seeing someone. Clemence isn't the first woman I've dated since the divorce, but this is by far the most serious relationship I've had since it ended. She's 8 years older than me. We actually knew each other for about 4 years before anything romantic happened. We shared a hobby, became close friends, and eventually realized there was more between us. And yes, I genuinely love her. It even surprised me when I realized it. I honestly thought my ex's betrayal had broken something inside me, that I'd never be able to love again the way I once did. At first, my daughters didn't know much about Clemence. Just like my previous relationships, I kept things private. But eventually, they started coming home earlier than expected and began seeing her around. Nothing inappropriate ever happened, but soon came the sighs, the cold looks, and the questions. What is she doing here? Don't you think it's unfair to Mom? It was like they thought I was dating just to spite their mother. I sat them down for a serious talk, explained everything over and over, but it just didn't sink in. They're still clinging to some childish fantasy where their parents get back together. Clemence, thankfully, is incredibly understanding. She doesn't take it personally and keeps saying, give them time. But honestly, I'm not convinced time will fix this. It hasn't yet, so why would it now? I've run out of ideas. That's why I'm asking for advice. Is there any way, any possible approach to help my daughters finally understand that I will never get back with their mother?
Sounds harmless enough, right? Well, not really. As much as I'd love to tell my ex to get lost and never see her again, we share 2 daughters and have joint custody. So, cutting her out of my life completely isn't an option, unless I'm willing to lose my kids too. We got married young, both 20, after dating for 3 years. Our twin girls were born during the first year of marriage. My ex had some complications after that,
which made future pregnancies difficult. At the time, I didn't care about that at all. I was just grateful she survived everything safely, and that we already had two beautiful little girls we adored. Our marriage lasted 9 years. It ended when I filed for divorce after discovering she had cheated. I have zero tolerance for that kind of betrayal, and saw no reason to keep suffering for something that wasn't my fault. Some might find it strange, but every ounce of love I had for her died the moment I learned the full story of her affair. So no, this isn't some sad tale about a man who can't move on. I did, 7 years ago. Hell, I don't even hate her anymore. I just couldn't care less what happens in her life as long as it doesn't affect our daughters. The real problem is that I'm the only one who truly moved on. My ex, her family, and even our daughters keep trying to reunite us, despite me being very clear that I have zero interest in ever being with her again. Maybe the fact that I didn't date anyone for years after the divorce gave them false hope. But honestly, I wasn't about to jump into another relationship that fast, especially when I had 2 girls to raise. They were my priority. Eventually, with the help of friends, family, and therapy, I got my mental health back on track. My relationship with my daughters has always been great. No fights, no yelling, no teenage rebellion, yet they're smart, kind, and we've always been close. But there's one big problem. They know their mother cheated on me because she told them about 3 years ago. Since then, I'm pretty sure she's been feeding them a twisted version of events. I've asked her countless times to stop dragging them into our adult mess, but she doesn't listen. She hasn't dated anyone since the divorce, hasn't even slept with anyone apparently. She thinks that makes her look noble. Personally, I find it insulting. When we were married, she was sleeping with someone else, and now she suddenly can live without intimacy for 7 years? Whatever, that's her problem. For years, I brushed off the occasional mentions of her looks or the photos my daughter showed me where she clearly dressed up just to make an impression. But things changed after I started dating again. My girlfriend Clemens isn't my first relationship since the divorce, but she's definitely the most serious one. She's 8 years younger than me, and we'd known each other for 4 years before we started dating. It grew naturally, from friendship into something deeper. And honestly, I love her. I didn't expect that. I thought my ex's betrayal had broken something inside me, that I'd never be able to love again. Turns out I was wrong. At first, my daughters didn't know much about my relationship with Clemens. Then they started showing up at my house earlier than scheduled, sometimes finding her there. We were never inappropriate, just living our normal lives. But soon came the questions, what is she doing here? Or, that's not fair to Mom. It's like they genuinely believe I'm seeing someone just to hurt their mother. I've had long, honest talks with them, but they just don't seem to get it. They can't let go of the fantasy that their parents might reunite someday. Thankfully, Clemens is understanding. She says the girls just need time, though I'm not sure that will help. It hasn't so far. So yeah, I came online looking for advice. Maybe someone out there knows how to help my daughters finally understand that no matter what happens, I'm never going back to their mother. When I try explaining that you can't be faithful to someone you're no longer with, they just ignore it. I've begged my ex countless times to stop manipulating the girls and keep them out of our adult issues, but she doesn't care. At one point, I even considered going to court to get full custody, but was advised it probably backfired. The truth is, my daughters know why we divorced. They know their mother cheated. I usually don't recommend telling kids something like that, but mine are old enough now. The problem is that their understanding of the story is based entirely on her version, filled with excuses and self-pity. A year ago, I finally tried explaining my side, only to find out she had already told them years before, when they were around 13. They know what she did, but they can't comprehend it emotionally. To them, their mother has always been loving and caring. They can't imagine her cold and distant like she was during the affair. Back then, she completely shut me out, not just physically, but emotionally. She stopped doing little things, morning kisses before work, random hugs, shared jokes, all gone. I realized something was off and eventually, with a close friend's help, uncovered the truth.
She had been giving all that affection to someone else. I'll never forgive that. My daughters don't understand why, and honestly, I don't want them to. No child should ever have to carry that kind of pain. So when they talk about regret, forgiveness, or getting back together, I just can't relate. Where was all that love when it mattered? Update. It's been a while since my original post. A lot has changed. My daughters actually found that post by accident. I had no idea they were even on that site. One day, I came home from work and found them both in tears. They ran to me, hugged me, and begged me to forgive them. Apparently, they'd read one of my comments and learned the full extent of their mother's affair and how deeply it hurt me back then. We went through a lot of therapy together. Honestly, I never blamed them. They were just kids, manipulated by their mother, who used their love as a weapon. After a few months of family therapy, the psychologist told us we no longer needed weekly sessions, just occasional check-ins. My daughters and I became closer than ever. Their relationship with their mom, though, took a hit, understandably. I told them not to dwell on her mistakes. I've long since made peace with what she did. That's also something we worked through in therapy. I eventually had a serious talk with my ex, made it absolutely clear that the getting back together nonsense needed to stop. Whether she listened or not, I don't know, but at least she stopped bothering the girls with it. Or maybe they've learned to tune her out. Either way, as long as my daughters are okay, I don't care what she's doing. As things settled, Clements and my daughter started bonding, really bonding. They started talking to her more, even asking her for advice on girl stuff. The first time I saw that, I nearly cried. Not long after, Clements and the girls surprised me. They organized a private dinner, just the three of us. Then Clements proposed to me. Yeah, she beat me to it. I was stunned, but happier than I had been in years. Not just because of her proposal, but because my daughters helped her plan it. We had a small, intimate ceremony with close friends and family, and now we're expecting a baby. My daughters can't wait to become big sisters, and I honestly can't wait to watch them spoil their new sibling rotten.
My boss demoted me, but still expected me to work just as hard as before. This happened a couple of years ago, but first I need to give a little background to set the scene. I grew up in a pretty poor family in the southern US. Despite that, I studied like crazy and earned a full scholarship to one of the top universities in the country, maybe even the world. I'm not trying to brag, it's just the truth. I realized early on that I absorb information fast, and it helps me work efficiently. And thanks to years spent collecting cans for money and working outside with my dad all day, I developed stubborn persistence and a strong work ethic. Being the oldest of 6 children, growing up in poverty also taught me to read people, their intentions, small cues, everything between the lines. In short, I was practically built for malicious compliance. After graduating from a great university, I moved back home to be close to my family and start my career. I also didn't care much for the Northeast, where my university was. It felt too gray and cold to me. I started with a crappy job just to get my foot in the door, then briefly worked at a startup. Eventually, I landed a position at a local government agency, earning almost double what I made before. The agency, well, specifically our county office, was notorious for insane turnover, awful coworkers, and an overall toxic and exhausting environment. Add to that the clients, who were often some of the most difficult people in the community, and the job drained every ounce of energy a person could have. But for a young guy, the salary felt good enough to deal with the pain. So when they offered me the job, I accepted, as cheerfully as someone can when walking straight into hell. I started in May. I worked my butt off from day one. I read the entire 350-page manual in my free time. I took on unpaid side tasks. I helped coworkers, even if it meant working more hours than I could handle. Sometimes I'd show up at 8 a.m. and wouldn't leave until 2 or 3 in the morning. I once had to cancel a long-planned date with my serious girlfriend because they called me in unexpectedly, and I stayed until late at night. I consistently worked far more than I wanted, but they just kept piling on work because I was performing well. My supervisor would always say things like, "That's just how things are here. It's for the good of the agency.
The best employees are the ones who sacrifice themselves for everyone else. Outside of work, she seemed like a perfectly pleasant woman, but a small part of me grew more irritated every time I heard those lines. By June, only 1 month in, I was already looking for escape routes, just like all the talented people who quit before me. I reached out to an MBA program that had always interested me, and they told me I should apply. Within a couple of days, the program director contacted me personally and scheduled an interview. The interview lasted 15 minutes. He thanked me for my time and ended the Skype call. Before the week was over, I received an email offering me a full-ride scholarship plus a small but very useful monthly stipend as long as I agreed to work as a graduate assistant for 20 hours a week during semesters. I was thrilled and signed the acceptance document immediately. Just like that, in under a week, I went from drowning under a growing mountain of stress to becoming a future graduate student. The program began in January, which gave me about 5 months. I decided I'd stick it out at the agency, save as much money as possible, and then leave in December. Since I'm an honest person, I told my supervisor about my plans and explained that I'd be resigning at the end of December because I'd been given an incredible MBA opportunity. She congratulated me, said she was glad for my success, and told me she'd think about the next steps and get back to me soon. A couple of weeks passed, each day draining me a little more, like a river slowly eroding its banks. Finally, she called me into her office for a meeting. She told me I could stay with the agency, but only if I agreed to move into what she called a contract position. She said they needed me to vacate my current role so they could open it as an official vacancy and prepare it for a new hire.
She insisted that all of this was for the good of the agency, and that someone as principled, hardworking, and ethical as me would agree to such terms, and should agree to them. Remember those words, because they'll matter later. I asked what exactly would change, and she gave me a vague summary. That wasn't enough for me. She wasn't a terrible manager, but life taught me one rule: never sign anything unless you've personally read every line. So I requested a week to decide and asked for all documents detailing every change, benefits, duties, restrictions, everything. She promised to bring the paperwork the next day. And that's where the malicious compliance began. The following afternoon, she handed me 12 double-sided pages packed with text. Every page was filled with size 10 times New Roman, the kind of formatting that makes sentences blend into each other like wet ink. Even the most dedicated reader would fall asleep halfway through it. I read the packet that night, and with each page, my mood sank lower and lower. I was losing nearly every benefit except my accumulated overtime. My title was being reduced. Several privileges I had earned were simply gone. But halfway through, something changed. I suddenly sat up. I had found a tiny clause buried deep in legal sludge, stating that under this new contract, I could not work more than 40 hours a week. I was forbidden from performing many of the tasks I had grown to despise. I was required to do only the duties explicitly listed in the new job description. In other words, once I hit 40 hours, I was done. No exceptions, no pitching in, no being a team player. As I reread that microscopic sentence, a slow smile crept across my face. At first it was small, the polite "I'm pretending to be interested" smile you give on a bad date. Then it grew wider and wider until I probably resembled the Grinch plotting to steal Christmas. I knew exactly what I was going to do. I was so energized I barely slept. The next morning, I walked into the office prepared. My manager was delighted to hear I accepted the new contract. Of course, she had no idea how happy I actually was. After I handed her the signed pages, she began explaining what she wanted me to handle over the next 2 weeks. I quickly, but calmly, told her I wouldn't be able to do that. I explained that as a responsible and ethical employee, I must strictly follow my new contract. She stared at me, confusion mixing with anger, as I laid it all out. I could no longer perform several tasks I used to because the contract prohibited them. I could not work overtime under any circumstances unless my hours were officially recorded. Once I reached 40 hours, I was required to stop working immediately and go home.
After-hours calls, emails, and messages, not allowed. Everything would have to wait until Monday at 8 a.m. I was no longer permitted to take on call shifts. They'd need to find someone else fast, which would be, challenging. I couldn't help coworkers the way I used to because I no longer had the authority, the time, or the legal right to do so. Her stare could have melted steel, and the longer I continued, the more intense it became. When I left her office, which was now seconds away from metaphorically exploding, I sat down and began drafting an email. Here's the thing. In my own position, you needed certified training before you were legally allowed to sign off on cases and documents. If you hadn't completed that training and anyone found out, attorneys could tear the agency apart. Because of the county's incompetence, I never got that training, yet they still had me doing a job from day one. Every request I made about it had been ignored. So I wrote the email. I addressed it to my former supervisor, the office manager, and the regional director, the usual trio who had ignored me before. But this time, I added 2 more recipients in the blind copy, the big boss from the central office and her even bigger boss. Networking and politeness, I practice them religiously. They pay off when it counts. I asked very respectfully when I would finally receive the mandatory training I had been promised months ago. I explained that I had been handling cases without the required certification and would have to continue doing so until my responsibilities were reassigned. 2 minutes later, I received a reply from the highest-ranking official in the entire state agency.
She expressed that she was saddened and disturbed to hear about my situation and promised she would personally ensure I completed the required training. She was also shocked that I had essentially been forced to accept a demotion just to keep my job. As a result, she guaranteed that under no circumstances would my salary be reduced. The most amusing part? I was being trained for a position I no longer held, so the whole exercise was absurd in itself. On top of that, the standard training sessions weren't even being offered at that time. This meant I had to travel to the state capitol for a special session, just me and a handful of other lucky employees from across the state. Since the capitol was far from home, company policy required that they provide a hotel room and a reasonable per diem. Thanks to some late-night research, I discovered that the city was hosting major events at the same time. I reported this to the big boss from the central office, explaining that no reasonably priced rooms were available near the training site. That would have been a contract violation on their part. Now it was their responsibility to find accommodation for me. In the end, the big boss exercised her authority and booked me a luxury suite in a stunning hotel, a pinnacle of cosmopolitan glamour, at least by local standards. The following week, I went to the week-long training. Let me remind you, this was for a job I no longer held and had no intention of ever doing again. My motivation, naturally, was minimal. The entire week, I did nothing but enjoy the luxury suite, expensive meals, and a couple of fun events in the city. In effect, I received a fully paid week off, even though I technically no longer had benefits. Returning to the office, I noticed that 2 coworkers from my department had quit, along with several others across the office. Chaos reigned largely because my letter from 2 weeks earlier had finally reached the central big boss. She had dug in, realized how badly our office was running, and acted swiftly and ruthlessly. She dropped the full weight of bureaucratic authority, and the office felt it. Thanks to my new contract status, I was required to do only what was explicitly stated in it. Due to office incompetence, I could complete all my assigned tasks in about 20 hours a week. Plus, with the chaos caused by coworkers being sent to training, I was often tasked with simply transporting items from one location to another, sometimes across the state. I was slightly annoyed that this distracted me from core duties, but of course I was willing to sacrifice myself for the agency. It allowed me to easily rack up hours, sometimes working 16-hour days doing almost nothing and getting paid for the mileage. I would sit at my desk, headphones on, quietly watching the world burn around me. My office life until my departure was simple: handle minor tasks, then do absolutely nothing, browse the internet, watch YouTube, etc., until I reached 40 hours for the week. Often I could leave for the weekend by Wednesday afternoon or Thursday morning.
My life had shifted from a nightmare to a balanced existence. I began enjoying life again, spending time with my girlfriend, playing video games, and pursuing hobbies. I even used accumulated overtime to pay for a Caribbean cruise in November, which I was thrilled about because many childhood friends were going. My once formidable, now comparatively humble boss quietly wished me a good vacation and expressed hope I'd return. I joked that I couldn't promise anything. I enjoyed a week in warm waters and on the islands, experienced the pleasure of cruising like a pro, and reflected on what I wanted from life, work, and myself. Back at the office on Monday, I waited for my boss. When she entered, she already knew what I would say. I could see the joy drain from her face, leaving only a hollow shell. I informed her that, unfortunately, I couldn't stay until the end of December. I needed to leave 2 weeks early due to unforeseen complications in my transition to the MBA program. She replied with a weary, strained tone, "I understand. Thank you for your 6 months of service. I'm sorry to see you go." And that's how I turned a demotion into a fully paid week off and nearly 4 months of easy work. Moreover, I turned her words against her, becoming the model ethical employee, strictly following my contract while creating office chaos for weeks as management scrambled to handle the attention from the central leadership. Recently, I discussed this story with my current girlfriend, whom I met at that very agency. She's amazing and makes me happier than I've ever been. I'm fairly certain I'll propose eventually. She mentioned that both my previous bosses, as well as the office manager and regional director, were eventually removed from their positions, enforced by the central big boss shortly after my departure. For those curious, I completed my MBA program with a perfect GPA, 4.0. Next week, I have an interview for a new position. Looks like I'll nearly double my income again.